Chapter 1. An unexpected move. A big swig of pale ale was taken from a mug that was almost overflowing. This used to be a beverage that he had no chance of obtaining back in his domain, but nowadays the taste of first-class booze flowing down his throat felt all too familiar. He noisily belched out the sweet fragrance of the ale as he set down the large mug, with half of its contents still remaining, back onto the table. If this were one of those wooden mugs he was so used to, he would have slammed it down onto the table without a second thought, but he wouldn't dare do so with the porcelain stuff. However, even if he did break the mug, he wouldn't have to pay for it. After all, this tavern was specially prepared by his secret supporter, Hilma Signius. Everything was free of charge for any of the nobles he would invite to this place. This policy even extended to their guests. This kind of investment was to be expected for someone who's destined to become a powerful noble like he was, Baron Philip Dayton Lair Montserrat. All he had to do was to show his gratitude and repay her for this favor later on, for now everything is kept on tabs. As things stood, even Hilma, whose wealth was beyond comparison to Philip's, was still a commoner and had to bow before authority. Perhaps that was the reason why she was trying so hard to become acquainted with a noble like Philip by supporting his faction on all fronts. This is what separates the strong from the weak in this world, the difference in status. Still, he owed her a big favor for all of her efforts. As a gentleman who held himself accountable for all his debts, Philip's hoped to improve his social standing as soon as possible. Hilma should also be expecting him to obtain authority above the rank of baron at the very least. Then he'd have to repay his dues. If those favors were not repaid as soon as possible, he would be stuck making concessions, having to obtain permission even for things he personally wanted to do. To have the freedom to do whatever he wanted and the right to use his powers as he sees fit, those were Philip's dreams. But, why is nothing going my way? He could no longer hold in his true feelings. Philip surveyed his surroundings. This tavern was not a regular peasant's bar. Hilma had converted one of her mansions into a tavern, so crude noise had no place in it. So although his voice wasn't too loud to begin with, if there were someone around they probably would have heard him. After confirming that no one was looking towards him, Philip calmed down. To allow others to find out that he had failed would be disgraceful. That's right, he had failed. Die, you're all trash. Philip gulped down ale as if it could quench the fiery emotions in his heart. This only agitated him further as in his hurry, drops of ale had leaked from the corners of his lips, causing his skin and clothes to feel sticky as a result. Philip's expression twisted in anger. If all had gone according to his plans, the output of his domain would have been multiplied and he should have been surrounded by people grateful that he was their new lord. His name should have been known to all after the neighboring nobles caught wind of his accomplishments. So, how did it end up like this? Not only had the grain productivity of his land started to fall, he also felt as though the villagers he had visited were all staring at him with contempt. Insolent scumbags. He was finally the head of the House of Montserrat, a family with a long and dated history. Those villagers should have known full well how they should pay their respects. Could it be possible that the villagers were all slacking off in an attempt to weaken his position? It was certainly possible. The world was filled with imbeciles who would be envious of others' talents after all. They couldn't even understand his talents and only scoffed at and got envious of those with talents. In that way, they could create an illusion of megalomania. No, it was not as though that was the only type of people in the world. There were so many villagers back there had to be some other reason for it. For example, a neighboring lord may have paid them to sabotage Philip's political ambitions. It was certainly not impossible. In general, if you focused production on more valuable goods, revenue would naturally rise by huge proportions. This should have been common sense. Wouldn't it make sense to dedicate all the available farmland to the more valuable crops and buy grain from traders? It was so obvious, yet the number of people who disagree with him were countless. Absolute trash. How about I ask Hilma about how I should punish these fools? If I do that, they'll certainly start working hard for me again. I'll still need to investigate if they're conspiring against me, their lord. No, wait. If it's something as simple as dishing out punishments, it'd be fine if I approve of it on my own, right? In theory, it'd be the same as whipping cows and horses to get them to obey you. Yeah, there's no need to tell Hilma about this at all. If I end up owing her another favor from this. Hilma's been good to me for quite a while, it's about time that I repay her generosity. To a soon-to-be great noble, debt owed to a commoner like Hilma could be built. It was an easily exploitable situation. But alas, doing so would make him no different than a common thief. As a noble among nobles, such an act was utterly despicable, so it's best to quickly pay her back as much as possible. It would be a big problem if he let Hilma have something to threaten him with due to his generosity. If that ever happened, Hilma could always have things her way and shut Philip up. The question is, what would be the best form of repayment in this case? If he's going by their previous agreement, he would have to repay her in gold collected from the increased revenue of his land, but that's obviously not possible, nay, it would be difficult to do so at the moment. So what was something that he could do that would both demonstrate his brilliance and also leverage the newly formed faction's power to benefit Hilma? I say that, but I still don't have total control over this faction yet. As a member of the faction, Philip had been given the opportunity to connect with all kinds of people. Though the number of members supporting the idea that Philip should be the faction's leader was steadily rising, he hadn't gained the support of the entire aristocracy. Hilma had aided him in that pursuit, but considering his age, social standing, etc., there were still some major hurdles he had yet to overcome. If Philip was to be in their position, he would be inclined to agree with their decisions too. The same speech given by a senior earl and a junior baron would not be convincing to the same degree. But doesn't that sound like they'll just be conforming to the traditions of the more established factions? Philip thought. Being members of a new faction, they could not act like some aging organization but should rather introduce radical changes into the system. As a man with the courage to experiment and innovate, Philip was the perfect fit for the role of leader in this faction. All the other guys are just so inflexible. Blinded by his feelings of irritation, Philip did not notice his mug had somehow become empty. More booze? Yes, my lord. Some maid that looked like she's employed at the establishment was just passing by, so he barked his orders at her. After taking a deep bow, she walked away in an odd manner, as if striking a pose, and Philip was unable to take his eyes off of her. Was it because her uniform was too thin? One could make out the shape of her buttocks. An attractive derriere is obviously a desirable quality to flaunt with, but this maid had demonstrated a clear understanding of what constitutes an acceptable interaction between a superior and their inferior through her work ethic. This pleased Philip a lot. Philip had already borrowed 2 maids from Hilma who were not so dissimilar to the one he's staring at. These ladies would do anything you ask of them, you could even stiff their salaries. Every one of Philip's household matters had been handled by them. Hilma also recommended people like butlers and exclusive merchants. Though Philip wanted to fire those who had been under his family's employ for a long time and just keep his subordinates at hand, his father's fervent rejection of that proposal made him give up. Well, if he was the one paying for those servants, then he would have definitely fired them to save expenses. As Philip vaguely thought about these matters, someone spoke to him suddenly. "Hey, Baron Montserrat. What's going on? You seem troubled." He turned his head towards the source of the voice to see 2 nobles in front of him. They had inherited their baronies at the same time, friends who belonged to the same faction. One of them carried a large mug topped with ale, while the other held a plate full of nuts. Baron Delvin and Baron Rokerson. Baron Delvin was a man who lacked the status and prestige expected of a noble of his rank due to his short stature and delicate constitution. The only aspect of him that matched with his status would be his raiment, so if he were to wear common clothes, no one would be able to tell that he was one with the aristocracy. As it stands, you could convince a large group of people into believing that he was just an actor pretending to be a nobleman for a comedic play. In contrast, Baron Rokerson cuts an imposing and sturdy figure. The man was thick in every dimension. Though he was a physically menacing man, he couldn't hold his own opinions without getting swayed by others. In Philip's eyes, Rokerson was more likely to be ordered around than order someone else around. Their domains neighbored each other, and it was a common sight for them to be working together. Philip remembered them due to a mental note he made to himself when they first met, that being why not just work solo like me? Are these seats taken? Please, do take a seat. Rokerson gave a gentle nod and sat down alongside Delvin. The maid seemed to have timed her entrance perfectly as she walked in with ale in tow. Here, cheers. It's our pleasure. According to legend, the act of clinking glasses together during a toast originated as a way to mix the contents of 2 cups together, proving that neither were poisoned. Philip knew of this fact and so used more force than was necessary. Alcohol was spilled onto the table. Some of it had landed onto Baron Delvin's clothing. It would be rude to say that his clothes had finally matched his appearance, but his garments, while noble in appearance, were not fresh and clean. No, it would be more accurate to say that it was reminiscent of a more traditional style, something that Philip would wear in the past, like a hand-me-down from his elders. Philip felt pity. What he currently wore was top-tier fabrics he had instructed Hilma to prepare for him. In other words, those 2 were not valuable enough to warrant such a level of investment from Hilma. Philip contemplated the tragedy of the apparent difference in their future prospects compared to him as he asked, "So were the 2 of you here for drinks too?" That's right, that's right. We were just here for drinks and were pleasantly surprised to find that Baron Montserrat was here too, so we came over to pay our respects. Right? It's just as you say, Baron Rokerson. No, what's this nonsense about paying respects? Aren't we equals? Comrades who were supporting each other? I never knew that someone as great as Baron Montserrat viewed people like us as equals. That does bring joy to our hearts. Right? It's just as you say. Now, if you will, please try some of these. The man on the opposite end hastily presented the hors d'oeuvres. Thank you very much, Baron Rokerson. We're no strangers, Baron Montserrat. Feel free to call me Wayne and him Igor. Understandable. Then I'd request that both of you refer to me as Philip. The 3 shared in a hearty laugh as they downed their pale alesh. But anyways, Philip Sama, what has been bothering you? You seemed quite troubled just then. Just then? At this point, the alcohol had slightly, yes, only ever so slightly dulled his mind. His anger flared back up. Those useless idiots keep giving me headaches. I'm talking about the peasants living on my land. So that's why, I completely understand. It's completely understandable for someone as sagacious as Philip to be angry over those who could never hope to grasp your thoughts. Common people like us aren't on the same level as you, right? Exactly, it's completely understandable for someone as smart as Philip to be angry over such matters. Philip was touched by their agreeing with him. They were nobles like him, so was it natural that they could understand his troubles? They too must also be perturbed by their own subjects' stupidity. The 2 of you get what I'm going through? We do. Though I'm not as outstanding as Philip, I've also had my fair share of experience with the issues you're faced with. Exactly, looks like we're out of ale. What are you doing not pouring ale for Philip? The maid that was summoned immediately brought over some ale straight to Philip. He raised his mug, now filled to the brim with ale. Here, let us toast each other once more. The mugs were smacked together. Philip downed his ale. Delicious. He felt as though the ale had never tasted better than in this moment. Perhaps it's because he's sharing a drink with his sympathizers. Most members of the new faction chose to distance themselves from Philip, one reason being that Philip was at the helm of the faction, consequently, he hadn't been able to make any friends. That was why Philip was in such a good mood. These two who had approached him gave him solace. He was overjoyed to the point of wanting to rub shoulders with them. "Philip, I'm honored that you'd rub shoulders with me, but your ale might spill. How about you down some of it first and then?" He spilled some ale again. Though it was free of charge, being so wasteful would be an insult against Hilma. Philip removed his arm from the other noble and drank in a rambunctious manner. "That's what I expected of you. You can certainly hold your alcohol, am I right?" "That's right, as expected of Philip Sama. PSSSHT. No, that's not true. It's just that this ale tastes better than usual when enjoyed with outstanding nobles like you." Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. Would speak such words that fill my heart with joy. As the two of us have a lower tolerance for alcohol, we can't help but be in awe of your capacity. The two of you can't drink much? They were both still on their first cup and the level of ale hadn't gone down much. It's embarrassing to admit, but to tell the truth, neither of us can find any appeal in alcohol, right? That's right, but since we're in this type of establishment, it would be awkward not to drink at all, so we're only taking tiny sips. Because we can't hold our alcohol, we're quite envious of men who could, like Philip. Please, do take our portion as well." Philip followed along with their suggestions and drank cup after cup. The more he consumed, the lighter his head felt. It was around this time when his face started turning red. "Now that's the way to do it. I remember Philip mentioning the idiots in your land, so what happened exactly?" "What was it? Did I talk about that?" "Yeah, you mentioned something along those lines. It appears to me that you might have had a little too much to drink. Should I bring some non-alcoholic beverages over? Does that sound agreeable?" "That's right. Philip, would you like some water? The water they serve here does not stink of moss." "That wouldn't be necessary. I'm fine. Heat pulsed across his face. He didn't need a mirror to know that his face had turned completely red. "I was talking about my woes. I'm broke. We're in a similar situation, am I right?" "That's right, our domains aren't exactly prospering either." No. It's not what you think it is. If those worthless peasants had done what I ordered them to, there should have been large sums of gold flooding into my pockets. But they don't work hard enough and won't listen. It's all their fault. Every single one of them is worthless." Philip is absolutely correct. This world is filled with worthless trash. I can understand your pain. By the way, what is the special product of your lands, Philip? "Nothing apart from agricultural produce at the moment." Damn it. A lot of trials were being run on various aspects of production, but none had borne fruit yet. Agricultural produce, it would be nice to have some kind of unique product, otherwise, typical agricultural products don't sell for much, but that's to be expected. The two noblemen spoke of a lot of their own opinions. They were correct, that was why there was a need to cultivate crops of higher value. It would be risky as it was probable that they would not be able to harvest the crop in the short run. The fact of whether a crop could be cultivated at all or not had to be investigated too. Even so, it was a necessary investment for the future, yet those lowly peasants would always use "our hands are full" as their excuse even in the face of a direct order. Considering that current situation, if nothing changes, then I could only wait for a bad harvest so the price of grain would go up. "What about your own Terry?" Wayne jabbed Igor with his elbow mid-sentence, and then he moved closer to Philip to whisper. "You're right, but even if a bad harvest occurs, the price won't necessarily rise. Did you know that there is a huge amount of cheap grain being transported from the Sorcerer Kingdom to the kingdom? So the price for regular produce is unlikely to fluctuate much, and it would be equally unlikely for any non-value-added product to fetch a high price." "What? Philip, you're being too loud." Philip surveyed his surroundings in a frenzy, lowered his voice, and then said to Wayne, "Is that true?" The intel was obtained from trustworthy sources. It was being spread amongst a few of the merchants in the capital. Apparently, the Sorcerer Kingdom has stored large quantities of grain in warehouses owned by the merchants in the capital. It was said that they were even allowed to sell them, but the Sorcerer Kingdom obviously had the priority input on how they were being used. So it wasn't merchants importing goods from the Sorcerer Kingdom to sell here, but rather, the Sorcerer Kingdom was storing food in the kingdom? That's right. I don't know much about the exact details other than the fact that it's there for storage only, and the Sorcerer Kingdom had already paid for the storage fee, or was it rent for the warehouses? In any case, the merchants made money from that deal. It wasn't much, but it was still something. Do people just rent out their warehouses so easily? Normally it would be difficult to secure storage space. But wasn't that warehouse district attacked by that fiend? I heard a lot of the warehouses were empty, and so the owners happily leased them out. Therefore, as long as the grain remains there, the merchants are not likely to raise the price of food. It's easy to imagine people saying things like, if it gets more expensive, I'd rather buy from the Sorcerer Kingdom should the price go up. Oh right, did you know about Arantel's huge grain storehouse? No. What of it? Within this huge warehouse, enchanted with the spell preservation, there are places where food will never rot, courtesy of a magical item. Until recently, military rations for over 100,000 soldiers were painstakingly collected from neighboring lands in preparation for a war with the Empire annually. Food collection takes time, so it could rot during the process, not to mention that obtaining food was harder during some time periods. That huge storehouse was built to counter these problems. Apparently, the magical item wasn't something that could be transported elsewhere, so it was formally gifted to the Sorcerer Kingdom. That means the Sorcerer Kingdom's surplus grain could be stored there for years. Even if the food could last for many years, the Sorcerer Kingdom is a country with a single city, Ainz. How's it possible for them to produce that much food? Even if the rumor spreads throughout the kingdom, grain prices should only drop by a tiny bit at most, considering the kingdom's large population. About that. According to some credible rumors, the Sorcerer Kingdom is using undead creatures to work large swathes of farmland. As a result, they saw a tremendous boost in their grain productivity. That way, even such a small territory could match the entire kingdom's output. If you think about it, we're talking about undead creatures that do not know fatigue. But, well, if you think of that food being made by the undead, it's hard not to feel disgusted by it. What? That's just cheating. Philip couldn't help but yell. The Sorcerer King could easily accomplish what he couldn't get his subjects to do, no matter how hard he tried. All the pain that he had to suffer through, the Sorcerer King deserved as well. Or, perhaps he should also be using the undead for farming? That being said, it's not like there's nothing suspicious about it. After all, even if the undead worked tirelessly around the clock, for them to match the entire kingdom's output is. Still, their agricultural output is quite high, there's no doubt about it. Right now, the Sorcerer Kingdom is sending food aid to the Holy Kingdom. Food aid? Jaldabaoth, the archfiend who brought chaos to our royal capital, appeared in the Holy Kingdom. It seems like his rampage caused some food scarcity issues, and the Sorcerer Kingdom responded by sending the food bought from the kingdom merchants as aid. A caravan with wagons full of grain passed through my territory the other day, so it has to be true. How much can remain in the merchants' warehouses if the food was used as aid to the Holy Kingdom? That's a fair point. Still, it's a necessity to stockpile food in order to prepare for bad harvests. Plus, I don't think the Sorcerer Kingdom used up all the grain they had bought as aid. That made sense. If Philip were the Sorcerer King, he would have also used the surplus food, which had been sitting in storage for quite a long time, as aid. Exactly. Well, bad harvests don't happen that easily, right? That's why it's risky to wait for the climate to influence the situation. A better solution is required. For example, if the Sorcerer Kingdom's grain supply suddenly disappeared, then the food produced in Philip Domain should sell for a high price. That being said, you can't just do things like instigating a war with the sole objective of forcing the enemy to burn through their grain supply. It was at this moment when an idea was formed spontaneously in Philip's head. If the fact that grain does not sell for much even during bad harvests depended on the continued existence of the Sorcerer Kingdom's grain supply, what would happen if that were to disappear? There was only one answer. Grain prices would go up. Next question, how could one make the Sorcerer Kingdom's stockpile of grain suddenly disappear? The hint was in Wayne's words. The Sorcerer Kingdom's grain production must fall. But this was not an easy task. After all, Philip couldn't just sneak into the Sorcerer Kingdom and burn all their fields, right? What about stealing the grain? The moment Philip thought of this solution, he felt as though a lightning bolt had struck his body. To take a foreign country's property by force was, by common sense, an extremely dangerous action. Even without taking the consequences into account, Philip simply did not have the military strength to take on an entire country at this current moment. But the kingdom should see the Sorcerer Kingdom as its enemy. After all, a significant portion of its own citizens was killed in the war. It would be strange to not view them as enemies. If that's the case, wouldn't it be a brilliant move to steal from an enemy? That way, Philip would be able to earn the support of the kingdom's ruling class, and perhaps there was even a chance he would be promoted to a higher rank in light of his contributions. Not bad. Isn't this a great idea? As the cherry on top, he could also sell the grain that was taken from the Sorcerer Kingdom. This is like killing 3 birds with 1 stone. A plan that was so perfect it could not be improved upon. But, how will I rob them of the grain? Should I discuss it with Hilma and hire mercenaries? No, that's no good. Mercenaries don't have a sense of honor. Only idiots would leave a trail behind that could be traced back to them and be used as blackmail material. Following that logic, only his own soldiers could work. He'd call them soldiers, but in actuality, they would just be a few armed villagers. He had considered forming a unit with trained soldiers instead of villagers who could only do farm work. Paying said soldiers with the grain that they would seize would be an excellent option. But still, marching straight into the Sorcerer Kingdom's territories would be dangerous. Philip's domain was some distance away from the Sorcerer Kingdom, so the cost of a marching army wasn't something that he could just shrug off. No, wait, didn't he talk about some of the Sorcerer Kingdom's caravans passing through his lands? What if I attack those? Was Philip alone enough to take on such large caravans? There was a limit to the number of villagers he could mobilize, but an overwhelming numerical superiority, enough to make the enemy surrender without any resistance, was absolutely necessary. Are you two free to have a chat? There's a matter that I would like to discuss with you all. We are. What's this thing? It's something good. Philip moved towards the pair and proudly began to explain his impeccable plan. What the hell, he should have said sorry at the very least. Wayne scoffed after saying goodbye to Philip. The garment that was now stained with beer used to be his father's and was quite old in both texture and design, making it quite a rare item. He had originally planned to show up to formal social gatherings with that garment, but now he would have to make preparations all over again. At the end of the day, the aristocracy was nothing more than a bunch of creatures whose eyes could not see past one's appearances. Clothing was naturally a part of the game, so what had just happened was absolutely unacceptable. But the truth was that Wayne was at the bottom of the upper-class society, so what good could have come from having some nice clothes? On the contrary, this shabby garment could signify the owner's weakness, and was therefore very useful for someone who wishes to be under the protection of their superiors. An outfit like this was a must-have for him to play the role of a weak nobleman on the stage that is a salon. So until he takes on the role of another character, he was under its care. That was why it was even more unbearable than usual to see it sullied. That is true. A voice beside him chimed in, prompting Wayne to turn to look at its source. Enough, that's enough. His voice turned somber along with the atmosphere surrounding him. Had Philip stood witness to this change, he would have been shocked speechless. Wayne was never the extroverted type, he just plain disliked conversing with other people. To do so, he would have to create layers upon layers of facades as he desperately attempted to pretend he was the extroverted and effusive type. "Sorry dude, I really can't handle that kind of a guy, so you had to take care of most of it." Igor had switched from his previous personality too. He now spoke in an unrefined manner, using language that none of the nobility would dare to be caught speaking. "No need, if you're really sorry, go practice a few of those pleasantries. Lower-level nobility like us have to put in real effort to appease those at the top. Life's just getting more and more difficult. I thought that once we inherited the barony we'd be able to join the racket of the aristocracy. Shameless flattery and ingratiation, just those two things alone annoy the shit out of me." "What are you talking about? Peasants have to deal with the same shit. Never mind who has it worse, everybody who's working under somebody has to be a bootlicker of sorts. And that's why I never wanted to grow up. Man, I miss the days when we were carefree enough to swing sticks around and pretend to be dragon slayers. There's no going back, so don't think about it. Anyways, just learn to flatter others. That brainlet seems to be a good candidate to practice on, right? Even if we fuck it up, our losses would be small." To noblemen of the higher echelon or those with more experience in life, basically those who had seen it all, nothing could satisfy them unless it was made to perfection. That was why they had to gain experience every time they had a chance. For real. "Well, the next time we meet him I'll try extra hard to put on a face." "Yeah, that'll do, that'll do. No one dislikes pleasantries. If someone you're talking to is annoyed at you, it just means that your ability to hold a conversation isn't there yet. Igor, I know this is hard. I'll make up for your flaws and you can make up for mine, that was our deal, but you can't just stop trying to overcome your own weaknesses because of that. It's not like we'll be with each other forever." Though Wayne might be more intelligent than the average person, he was completely outmatched in terms of athleticism. Igor was the complete opposite. If they were of the same type, perhaps they would have been competitors instead. It was for this reason they were grateful for the fact that neither of them thought of each other that way. It was unusual for neighboring lords to be friendly with each other, but since they were the third and fourth sons of their family, they weren't indoctrinated with animosity from the past. That was why they were so close. Most importantly, they had chemistry. Is that so? So, what about what we discussed with him? Absolutely terrible. Wayne did not hesitate for a second before answering his friend's question. For someone like him to be at the helm of the faction was just far too dangerous of a situation. But, wasn't that guy easily manipulated? That's true. This faction was, frankly speaking, a garbage dump. Its members were only in it to capitalize on their status as noblemen and had absolutely no interest in developing their lands. Like a child with an iron sword, they abused their windfall authority. They had accomplished nothing whatsoever yet were overconfident enough to believe they were omnipotent. These people were beyond saving. Even someone like Wayne could understand that he was just a completely ordinary nobleman, yet they couldn't. The faction was full of that kind of people. It was safe to say that, because of this, the faction had a huge problem. The Sorcerer Kingdom storing grain in the capital is a disturbing development because they theoretically have complete control over its market price. They'll definitely raise the prices due to our bad harvest this year. What's even more terrifying is the fact that the nobles who are optimistic about such a blatant trap and have switched their farmlands to only grow cash crops aren't the minority. Their mentality is that even if anything bad were to happen, they could get through a famine by importing grain from the Sorcerer Kingdom, even if the price is a bit higher. A lot of landed nobles in this faction had this mentality. Despite his attempts to subtly hint at the perils of doing so, their attitudes clearly demonstrated their belief that they alone would not be affected by it. They were determined to put their plans into action. We lost a great amount of our labor force in that war. It's easy to see that they're fixated on the short-term profits based off of how they're distributing their remaining workforce alone. To let go of petty gains and instead focus on long-term profits should have been common sense for those at the top of the hierarchy. So to even think of robbing a sorcerer kingdom's caravan of grain is evidence that he's got brain damage. Surely no one is stupid enough to not understand that attacking a caravan that's flying the sorcerer kingdom's flag would be treated as a declaration of war and would result in serious retribution? Even if he's this, hold up. Were we being deceived? It was certainly possible that they were being set up and he just couldn't figure out what that man's goal was. Perhaps it wasn't such a bad choice to accept his proposal after all. No, aren't you overthinking? It's probably because he was really that much of an idiot that he didn't consider the potential consequences at all while he was coming up with that plan. Hey now, Wayne smiled bitterly, to not consider the consequences of attacking those wagons at all. Can an idiot of that magnitude really exist? Well, if you put it that way, at any rate, there was no plausible way that a noble without common sense would be chosen to inherit his family's title. Hence, Philip must have had a goal. What could his goal be? It's best if we consult Signius, right? No, don't tell her. Hilma Signius, the woman who did everything in her power to establish this faction. It was rumored that she was a lover of a certain earl, but the formation of this faction would not have benefited said earl in any shape or form. And so, the origin of her overly plentiful funds and wide connections remained a mystery. It was probably an organization, not an individual, that was behind the woman. By the simple process of elimination, one could easily arrive at which organization would have had such capabilities. The Eight Fingers. The crime syndicate controlling the kingdom's underground society. In that case, Hilma was probably someone who could be readily discarded, like a mannequin. No, Wayne's intuition told him. His few conversations with her told him that she was definitely not some simple sacrificial pawn. In fact, it was more than likely that she was one of the higher-ups of the organization. To have someone like her embedded in the faction was worrying to say the least. Although some nobles had the power to covertly form pacts with the crime syndicate, Wayne did not want to get entangled with such illegal organizations himself. It was precisely because they didn't think too highly of themselves that they would want to take advantage of her whilst maintaining a smooth operation. Why? Looks like you're thinking about something that I won't be able to grasp again, but isn't it about time that you tell me what's going on? Even I know that saying yes to that guy will get us into trouble in the future. We're about to attack a sorcerer kingdom's caravan in your territory, you know? That bony bastard is definitely not gonna just let it slide. There's no way that that guy's not losing his head after this, and yours might not stay connected to your neck for long either. Igor was completely correct, but Wayne had an idea. He had agreed to the proposal with a full understanding of the risks involved. Perhaps that is that idiot's plan, to make us his scapegoats and pocket the stolen goods for himself. How about we go along with his plan? We'll be patrolling our own territories and will just so happen to stumble upon a group of bandits, the group that was responsible for the attack on the Sorcerer Kingdom's caravan. After that, we'll kill them all. It's crucial that we alone are responsible for taking care of him. If an individual's caravan were to be attacked, no victim would simply stand down after receiving the news that the perpetrators were killed. This holds true even on a national level. Retaliation would have been more than warranted. This is why they must not leave behind any evidence of their involvement. Moreover, they had managed to make it easier for them to maintain their innocence by painting the narrative that they were simply taking care of an incident that had coincidentally occurred on their lands. How about that? Not a bad plan to gain favor with the Sorcerer Kingdom, right? Even if we are suspected of involvement, we can just say that we were attempting to help aid the caravan. We'll be fine as long as the perpetrators are all dead. You know what they say, dead men tell no tales. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but we do have to consider the possibility that there are priests who could resurrect the dead. You know what they also say? No lie slips by the priest. Do you seriously believe that there are priests capable of resurrection in the Sorcerer Kingdom? In a country where the undead are said to proudly walk the streets, tormenting the living? No, I guess? Wayne grinned as he concurred with Igor. Regardless of that man's goals, an attack on a Sorcerer Kingdom's caravan is beneficial to us no matter the outcome. It doesn't matter if the attack succeeds, which I don't think it will, or fails, because the Sorcerer Kingdom would be on high alert for further attacks in the future either way. They might stop storing grain with the kingdom's merchants. That way, those idiots would get a wake-up call and start making plans with a more solid foundation. Also, Wayne laughed mockingly, that man will be done for no matter what. Is he worth all the hassle? For us to take all of these risks just for him? Of course he's not worth it personally, but it's necessary to hinder Cygnus, the woman behind him, even if it's just by a little. She must be planning to use him to manipulate the faction and draw attention away from her, ultimately allowing her syndicate to operate in one form out in the open. If that weren't the case, it wouldn't make sense for them to invest so much money into the faction. The royal faction and the noble faction had already lost much of their power. If one could freely manipulate this third faction of theirs, they would be able to wield a terrifying amount of authority. This meant that the Eight Fingers would be in charge of both the kingdom's legal and illegal affairs. I would only be able to come up with temporary solutions for these things, but you've already thought this far ahead? As Igor said, such an idea should be out of reach of the minds of nobles, let alone a lowly baron. The truth is, of course, not all barons are the same, some of them owned more land than nobles of a higher rank. Unfortunately, for the two of them, their territories were of sizes befitting a baron, so they were your average barons in the kingdom. All the nobles without connections in the royal faction or the noble faction wanted to do was to better develop their land. For this to happen, the kingdom must also change for the better. They had the idea not just because they were nobles, it was also born of their own ambitions. What they desired was to become wealthier and happier. That's why they would exploit any beneficial opportunities to its maximum potential. But even if we switched to a better faction, we would have to rebuild our reputation and connections all over again, right? Yeah, right. They had joined the faction to obtain opportunities that would otherwise be unavailable to them had they joined a more well-established faction. However, they never expected the Eight Fingers to appoint such a cretin to its leadership position. It seemed as though joining this faction was a mistake. Speaking of which, would the Sorcerer Kingdom use this as an excuse to declare war on the kingdom? Wayne thought about it for a moment and shook his head. Unlikely. The Sorcerer Kingdom is a nation with a single city, they lack the manpower to fully occupy the entire kingdom. Even if they have a lot of undead, they're only suitable for simple manual labor anyways. They can't properly manage a country, so even if war was declared, they would only ask for land that is closest to them at most. It shouldn't be an issue for nobles like us whose land is far from the Sorcerer Kingdom. Now then, he raised up a clenched fist as he spoke and Igor mirrored his movements to give him a fist bump. Let's do this. Yeah. Philip had finally reached his destination, a patch of road in Baron Delvin's domain. He had led his soldiers on a march, starting from the previous day and camping overnight to the location of the attack. According to his intel, the Sorcerer Kingdom's caravan would be passing through this place. Philip was on horseback, looking down upon his lined-up soldiers. They were soldiers, or more accurately villagers, under his command. A total of 50 were gathered. He had sent draft orders throughout his entire territory, but not many men responded to the call. The most common response was that they had already served the time they were obligated to. The truth was, this heavily upset Philip. The plan was devised for the future prosperity of their lands, for the good of everyone who lived there. There was also an abundance of potential spoils of war, which Philip had given thought to and proposed that it should be distributed to everybody. Still, no one came to help. They were too foolish. A bunch of ignoramuses who could not tell if something was beneficial to them or not. Nay, this was the exact reason why they had to be led and lorded over by a genius such as himself. Despite trying so hard to convince himself otherwise, his anger towards those who did not understand him flared up. He had thought about forced conscriptions, but that would definitely enrage his old man, who already had a foot through death's door. In the end, he paid them in advance with the money he had borrowed from Hilma. After all of his hard work, he managed to gather 50 men, but these were either old geezers well past their prime, sick youths with frail bodies, or men with inflated egos who went around looking for fights in their villages and were generally fractious. To put it bluntly, they were the nuisances of their village and none of them were worth the money. Even so, Philip felt an indescribable excitement basking in the gaze of his soldiers. He had a hunch that a widely circulated heroic tale of his own was about to begin. No, it had already begun. As his territory will inevitably expand, so too would his status grow. He would soon be joining the world stage under brilliant limelight. He was about to deliver the first blow to the Sorcerer Kingdom, a feat no one else could accomplish. As a ploy to contain the Sorcerer Kingdom, this would surely allow Philip to receive high praise from the royal family and a rank that was befitting of such an achievement. Perhaps he could even marry that beautiful princess. So, my lord, can we actually attack them? Philip, who had been basking in his dream, was jolted back to reality as if a bucket of cold water had just been dumped over him. He returned to his senses and looked at the soldier who had asked the question. The soldier was an ordinary man, around 30 years old. He wore disheveled clothes and, for some reason, was holding a wooden shovel. Even a club would have been better than a shovel, perhaps even some of the sticks lying around here would have worked as well. Philip wanted to say something about that, but the shovel was probably the result of his order to have them bring their own weapons. Frankly, seeing that a few of the villagers were without even sticks gave Philip a bit of a headache. Apart from them, however, the group as a whole appeared as though they were some destitute bandits. Perhaps it could even fool their opponents into believing so. The soldiers around them apparently agreed with the man's doubts, as everyone within sight turned their heads towards him as if to say, "Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing. It'll be fine, this is a move to save the kingdom, my lord, we don't really get the whole kingdom thing, it's too complicated for us. We won't get tied up and have our heads chopped off though, ye?" Another man asked, and soon the others started to echo along with their yes. Philip was greatly surprised by the questions that demonstrated a complete lack of an understanding of justice. It's precisely because so many people like them exist, that someone talented like me has to lead them. Nobody obeyed my plans on farm management because these people could only think on a surface level. I said there would be no problems. Are you all deaf? No, we aren't. The soldiers were not convinced, their spite was visible. Maybe he should have executed someone as a warning to the others, but that would make it seem like he couldn't lead at all. He would lose his dignity if he couldn't get them to work, despite knowing that there were risks involved. As Philip panicked and knew not what to do, he heard the overpowering sound of horses' hooves stomping on the ground. He turned his head to see 2 horsemen galloping towards him. Their faces were both covered save for the eyes, but he still knew who they were. The 2 stopped afar and waved at him. Why didn't they come over here? Shouldn't they come towards me and not the other way round? Philip thought maybe they had something to say that must be kept secret. I guess I have to. He could finally feel a bit better about himself by saying things in a pretentious manner and so changed his expression to a flippant one to match. Philip moved towards them on horseback. He'd had some practice riding, so having a horse walk in a straight line was not a problem. "Baron, how are your preparations coming along?" The man's face was masked, so it was hard to identify him, but judging from the voice and his build, the man could be deduced to be Baron Delvin, or Wayne. His outfit, however, was nothing like that of a baron's. The hide armor was a bit dirty and a sword hung by his waist. His horse looked bored and lifeless, like a farm horse instead of a war horse. Next to him was Baron Rokerson, or Igor, who looked pretty much the same. Their appearances matched so well that even their horses looked similar. Unlike Philip, who had some financial backing, they must have been quite poor. Philip thought about the time when he had seen them wearing shabby clothes and tried his best to hide the sense of superiority that was about to show on his face. Well, now I can't show this pathetic duo that I'm irritated by my soldiers' low morale, can I? This is such a pain. He, as someone of higher status, must show to those below him exactly what made him superior to them. Philip must act as a role model for society, and the inferior must follow Philip. That way, the world could run smoothly. Only the two of you? What about your men? We have already prepared them, right? Exactly, our soldiers will flank Philip and form the crane wing formation. The crane wing formation? Even Philip knew about that formation. Deploying such a famous formation was quite a gratifying thing to do. It was as though he had become the protagonist of some tale. So, if things go south, please scatter towards the left and right. The enemy won't scatter if we only go in one direction. Remember to spread as far apart as possible when retreating. I understand. It's fine, you don't need to remind. Wouldn't it be better to decide in advance who should go which way? A successful retreat can be difficult in the heat of battle. This applies to Philip as well. Which direction will you be retreating to? They spoke as though they had foreseen his defeat. This made Philip quite upset. So you're sure that I'll lose? No, it's nothing like that, Philip. Have you heard of the tactic of feigning a retreat to exterminate all the pursuing enemies in one go? Yes, I have. I see, Philip accepted their explanation, but since it would be unpleasant to admit his ignorance, he acted as though he had already known of the tactic. As I thought, you knew about it. Well, there you have it, this is the strategy, one that includes a strategic retreat. Well, in that case. As Philip was getting ready to discuss which way to retreat to, he realized that an important piece of information was missing. Before I answer, I have a question. You two haven't told me about the size of your forces yet. How many men did you bring? 75 each. Philip was so shocked that they could muster up more men than he could that the thought with these numbers, escaping in any direction would be the same never crossed his mind until later on. Philip rationalized that, since this was their domain after all, it made sense that it wouldn't be as difficult for them to do so. If this were simply a matter of quantity, things would be much easier. The problem lied in their prior considerations. Philip estimates that he could have mustered at least twice the number of men had this been his domain. If we have this much manpower, doesn't it make more sense for us to attack all at the same time? After all, we have around 200 men here. Though that would be a viable option too, it wouldn't be the crane wing formation. For it to be a crane wing formation, Philip's soldiers must advance first, with our forces covering the side flanks. So that's why. Right, that's why. He had managed to completely forget about it. Wayne let out an audible sigh. Since his face was completely covered, no one could see his current expression. I'm glad you could understand. Now then, which direction should we retreat to? Yes. We'll retreat towards Igor direction then. So towards the left flank, I understand. Then I'll request that you stick to the battle plan we had discussed before. Please also keep an eye out for archers. It's not so uncommon for horses to kill their riders in a stampede once they've been struck by arrows. As long as I have this armor, I'll be fine even if a horse stepped on me. This is a high-grade item that was crafted by a renowned blacksmith and enchanted by magic casters. Philip's armor set was a gift from Hilma. The armor had been enchanted with magic that boosted its defense, allowing it to outclass the armor set that had been passed down as a family heirloom in his house. Though he had received this gift quite a while back, he had never had the chance to try it out yet. This will be the armor's debut. That baron over there certainly did not have something of such high quality. Philip tried his hardest to stop his sense of superiority from showing up in his voice. Even so, it's best to err on the side of caution. Everything would be for naught if we're to be killed in the fray. This is the truth. That's correct, because Philip is our general. Even if you're donned with such excellent armor, there are still weak points where an arrow could strike. In addition, no matter how durable the armor is, it cannot defend against most spells. Please do not let down your guard because of the armor. After all, Philip is our general. Their repeated warnings greatly annoyed Philip, but he understood where they were coming from. If a general were to be slain, then the battle would be over. That was common sense. Knowing that these two saw him as their leader, Philip couldn't help but smile. Of course, I understand. Also, where will Philip deploy our formations? It would be too dangerous to deploy on the road. I believe it would be best to stay back, that way we could rush to your aid if we have to retreat. It would help if you can tell us your position. Umu. Philip was in agreement. When the general is in danger, it is the duty of his subordinates to rush to his aid. Though this was common sense, Philip was shocked that he wasn't the one to suggest this in the first place. I would have noticed these things if this was the usual me. Right now I'm just too excited. This is my first time organizing a battle of this scale. Philip gulped slightly and took a deep breath. What's wrong? Nothing. I was just trying to temper the fiery passion for this battle in my heart. I see. Is that so? Then where would Philip like to wait for the caravan? First of all, Philip took a look to his left and right. The paved roads were quite wide, enough space for two carriages to pass through side by side. This road seemed to be a major source of income for Baron Delvin. There were lush forests to the sides of the road, but the closest spots to the road where bandits would usually hide had been cleared completely down to just grass. The forest was under human management, apparently to allow pigs to forage the grounds for acorns and the like, so there was no need for them to be on alert for monsters or wild beasts. If that's the case, we'll set up the ambush in the forest. I see. If that's the case, I know of a suitable spot. There's a patch of forest where twigs, weeds, and whatnot have already been cleared out, that could allow us to retreat on horseback. How do you feel about that? Such a place exists? Indeed. When Philip decided to launch the ambush in these lands, we knew something like that was necessary, so we took the time to prepare that spot. Philip had repeatedly chosen this patch of land for the ambush in their previous meetings. Though he had asked Wayne and Igor for their opinions, both of them deferred to Philip. It must have been quite troublesome for them to make preparations after that. Then I'm truly grateful to you. Nonsense, since you had to take on the risks of leading the first charge, what we did was just our fair share, right? It's just as Wayne had surmised. The two led Philip to the site and it was just as they had described. There shouldn't be an issue for horses to gallop if the grounds were in this condition. As he finished his discussion with the two, Philip simply walked back to his soldiers. Philip couldn't stop sweating because of his full plate armor, and because they were on uneven ground, his helmet could cause him to lose his balance and fall over easily. Philip wheezed heavily as he took off his helmet to clip on below his waist. He took out a handkerchief and began to furiously wipe his forehead. Philip felt like the armor was a failure. Even though an armor's defensive capabilities are its most important quality, mobility is equally as important. He seems to remember that there were enchantments that lighten armor. He'll have to ask for one of those in the future. Or perhaps an enchantment that prevents him from sweating while he's wearing the armor. He should talk to Hilma about this the next time he's in the capital. After making a mental note of that, he walked back to the site where he saw his soldiers bored out of their minds doing nothing. Sorry for the wait. Milord. Who is that man who's covered his face? His appearance screams bandit. Are we being set up? That's impossible, that man's obviously an esteemed noble of the kingdom. Speaking of appearance, don't mention it. It's not as though every nobleman could afford full plate armor. Plus, during the Battle of the Katsa Plains, those families that had lost their successors also lost many heirloom weapons and armor. Philip's household was in this exact situation. If he loses this set of armor, it would be difficult to acquire one again. Though it appears the soldiers do not believe in his reasoning, there was no need to force them to accept it. Okay. Let's wait till the caravan arrives. After it does, we'll attack it immediately. Philip heard no response and raised his voice. Do you understand? Understood, though everybody answered begrudgingly, their voices in unison were still loud enough to be heard. Philip was unsatisfied with their response, but he'll have to leave it at that. This is their first battle after all, there was no need for them to meet all expectations. For them to develop into excellent soldiers, they will have to focus on the most immediate problems at hand. As Philip mulled over these thoughts, he sat on the ground as if his body was giving in to the desire for rest. A vast criminal syndicate known as the Eight Fingers lurked in the shadows of the kingdom. There existed 8 divisions within the syndicate, one of them being the smuggling division. Christopher Olsen, a member of said division, sported the face of an honest merchant. His words carried quite a bit of weight on the major trade route connecting the royal capital to the west side of the kingdom. As such, he'd had the first-hand experience of having his warehouses be looted clean of various types of goods during Jaldabaoth's rampage. They had substantial losses, but it did not spell the end for his company. Still, a considerable amount of time was now necessary to recover those losses, so he found it to be a necessity to borrow a portion of the funds from the Eight Fingers. You've got to spend money to make money, that was how businesses operated. Of course, it could also lead to greater losses, but as long as he kept his head down and avoided unnecessary risks, there was not much to worry about. Borrowing money from Eight Fingers, however, would start one down the gradual path towards losing oneself. The Eight Fingers would force merchants who had made losses into criminal activities such as smuggling, selling, or transporting narcotics. Merchants fell into this trap quite often. So what about Christopher, who had already been ensnared? In order to borrow money, he'd had a meeting with the leaders of the divisions, which shocked him, to say the least. Christopher belonged to the smuggling division, so the management of loans should have been done by his superiors in the same division. Meetings with the executives of the other divisions should have been an impossibility. Despite all of this, he got to meet with the top brass. Was it because his accomplishments had earned him a high recommendation? Or was it some other reason unbeknownst to him? He couldn't figure out why even after the meeting had concluded. The only thing that he was certain of was his suspicions towards the division's leaders' unusually friendly attitude towards him, knowing full well how they were feared even by the dark side of society. Of course, goodwill from mafia heads could just as easily be faked as anything else. Another thing that caught his attention was the fact that they, befitting their status at the highest echelon of the organization, apparently took their own health quite seriously. While he wondered if they were perhaps a bit too skinny, they were definitely healthier compared to his overweight body. Such people of importance had given him a job on the spot. The kind of job to be given out depended on various factors, such as the amount of money borrowed, the value of the person as a human being, and whether that person could be of use to Eight Fingers in the future. Those with better ratings were given safer jobs, and vice versa. The job given to him was transportation of the Sorcerer Kingdom's grain. Whether or not it's safe is still unclear. What's the matter? Did you say something, sir? Don't mind me. I'm just mumbling to myself. The one to respond to his question was the leader of the mercenary division. He was a robust man. Very much different from Christopher, who was in his 40s and saved up a thick layer of fat around his waist. The man was young, sharp, and apparently only in his 20s. He wore a steel chestplate with chainmail underneath. A helmet that could cover his entire face sat next to him, together with a well-worn sword. The man was the leader in charge of protecting the Sorcerer Kingdom's grain caravan, which consisted of 7 horse-drawn carriages and wagons. The security detail consisted of 24 people in total, all of which were employed by Eight Fingers and, like Christopher himself, belonged to the smuggling division. Though they were members of the same department, they still charged for their service and at a rate higher than that of mercenaries of a similar level nonetheless. On the other hand, they no longer had to worry about information leakage for secret missions as they were more loyal to the mission at hand. In the face of threats that couldn't be taken care of, regular mercenaries would probably just abandon the mission, but these men would fight as rear guards to their death. This was understandable, as abandoning the mission would cost the higher-ups their dignity. As a result, they would have been hunted down and murdered even if they were to make it out alive. Therefore, for someone like Christopher who did not know of any trustworthy mercenaries, these men from the Eight Fingers were probably his best choice. But then again, for this mission, they were his only choice. It was a direct order from the higher-ups to use these men. To make up for the lack of options, they were to provide their services for free, and so he had surplus funds to hire even more mercenaries. However, hiring extra mercenaries would be seen as a sign of distrust towards the men. Never mind the fact that their employment was specified by the top brass, so hiring other mercenaries could be seen as him disobeying their orders. After giving it some thought, Christopher decided against hiring extra mercenaries. Moreover, all of the guards appeared to be quite capable, but of course, Christopher, who was no warrior, could not properly grasp their strength. That was not a problem, however, as the higher-ups have vouched for them by claiming that they were outstanding. Going against orders would be dangerous regardless of the reason. That being said, if he were to be asked whether he felt it was safe to depart with such a small detail, he would have wished for more capable men. It would have been great if he could borrow a boss from the security department, a member of the Six Arms, the enforcement group of the Eight Fingers. Needless to say, that wish would never come true. It was said that the Six Arms, including its leader Zero, who was said to be the strongest warrior in all of the Eight Fingers, was exterminated in a conflict with the royal family, just before the calamity caused by Jaldabaoth. Credible intel attributed their defeat to Ainz Ooal Gown, a warrior serving under the Golden Princess. It would be outrageous to assume that all 6 of them were defeated by a single person, but apparently Blue Rose, an adamantite-ranked adventurer group, had joined the fight as well. Christopher deduced from this that it was most likely a 6 versus 6 battle. The security department was said to have lost most of its members in the battle. At the moment, every department was building up a force of its own to compensate for the loss, to the point where even members of the assassination division began to operate out in the light. Nevertheless, this managed to improve the mood of those within the Eight Fingers to the point where it was now better than it was before the appearance of Jaldabaoth. Internal conflicts were rife in the past, and it wasn't unlikely for one to fall victim to dirty tricks being played behind their backs. Some merchants were even reported to the authorities by people from the other departments during the most crucial stages of a smuggling mission. At the moment, however, the higher-ups were being so cooperative with each other that it was almost disgusting to think of. Business had expanded as a result, and illegal profits from each endeavor grew too. The mercenary leader farted audibly while yawning. It was an unavoidable physiological phenomenon, and he had no intention to apologize. A disgraceful action. Christopher frowned. That was the worst sound to wake up to from a daydream. He honestly wanted to complain, but this man was to be his companion during the trip to and from Level, a large port city on the west side of the kingdom. His desire to maintain a friendly relationship with him suppressed his desire to complain. Ships would be used to transport the cargo from Level to the Holy Kingdom, so that would be the job of a certain maritime merchant. He was a great man, and Christopher knew him well. It came as a surprise to him that the man was also a member of Eight Fingers, but he claimed they were collaborating solely for the mutual benefits. Still, he couldn't help but worry. You seem relaxed. You don't think anyone's going to attack? I haven't gotten that stinging feeling, so no problem. You probably wanted to say that feelings can't be trusted. Well, I understand where you're coming from, but you surely have also had moments when you thought this will work out fine, right? There are also times where you have had a bad feeling about something, so you try to plan for it, and it ended up being true, or something. Yeah, I've had those experiences. See? Our past experiences can function as our intuition. The mercenary leader spoke in a tone that didn't seem to match his appearances at all. See? Well, we're also flying the Sorcerer Kingdom's flag. Only ignorant villagers turned bandits would dare attack such a caravan, in which case, we can easily take care of even 100 of them. What if it isn't villagers? Are you worrying about down-and-out mercenaries? Would they not be able to recognize the flag of the Sorcerer Kingdom, the hottest of all topics? He shrugged. Experienced mercenaries are surprisingly well informed. Those who don't even know of the flags of the countries around don't scare me at all. Looks like you're not buying it. Think about it, wouldn't it be worrying to not know which noble you're picking a fight with? You wouldn't want to get into trouble that way, would you? That makes sense. I'm curious, which nobles are the riskiest to pick a fight with? About that, for example, the famous ones like Raven and Bullop. The likes of them have strong armies stationed within their own territories, and it'd be dangerous to bump into them. Well, they both suffered great losses in that war, so maybe they're not as dangerous as before. Still, shouldn't be careless. Blumrush pays well, so I don't want to get on his bad side. Well, I simply just don't want enmity from any of the noble lords. But you're being backed by a criminal syndicate. Are you being serious? So are you, right? If I get into trouble with them, the big shots will just abandon me without a second thought. Same goes for you, yeah? Yeah. They fell silent and the mood began to feel a bit gloomy. They were reminded of the ruthlessness of the top brass, but there was nothing they could do about it as people who were part of such an organization purely for the profits. Perhaps there was a way of life for him that did not require any connections to the organization, but that wouldn't have led to him becoming the great merchant that he is today. Perhaps he would still have had to stick to smaller business deals to this day. The word "if" carried the connotation of an infinite number of possibilities, but without the means to travel back in time, one must be satisfied by the present. Anyways, just don't worry, right? I get it. So what's the worst threat that we could face as of now? If the enemy were to use flaming arrows to try and burn down the caravan, burn, not rob, that would mean that we're getting involved in some greater conspiracy, a national problem. Or a rival organization's ploy. An organization that could rival the Eight Fingers. Is that even possible? Don't know. But even a rival group probably wouldn't want to burn the Sorcerer Kingdom's goods, unless they're confident that no clues would be left behind. Personally, I think national conspiracies or ploys from the kingdom or other neighboring countries are far more concerning. We're probably under a higher threat to receive an attack from those sources. If that's the case, then there's no point in worrying about it. Right? Anyways, it looks safe for now. Don't worry, just sit tight. The caravan was soon approaching a forest. They could utilize that fact to estimate their approximate location. Christopher opened up a mental image of a map to confirm that they were indeed making good progress. He could finally relax. Messing up a job related to the Sorcerer Kingdom would invite some terrifying consequences. The time was around noon. They just had to pass through this forest and then they could take a break as planned. This wasn't a wild forest, it showed signs of being well maintained by men, so it shouldn't take too long for them to traverse through this place. The sound of bolting horses could be heard within the wobbling carriage, which was when the carriage also started slowing down. Christopher took a peek at the mercenary leader and found his aura to be completely different from just then. Things were getting serious. Excuse me, but it looks like I have a job to do. Two men poked their head through the portiere, subordinates of the mercenary leader. Sorry, boss. This guy said there are a lot of villagers hiding in the forests. The mercenary said as he turned to face Christopher. The one who he had referred to as this guy was their scout. Not bandits, but villagers? How'd you know that? Yes. First is their equipment. They were neither armored nor armed. Many of them are using hoes as improvised weapons, not clubs, but hoes. Even rocks could be weaponized, but hoes you say? That's odd. No, were they metal hose? I couldn't get a closer look, but they appeared to be made out of wood. Christopher, who had been silently listening in to the conversation, thought that it must have just been regular villagers who were returning home after working on their farms. Really? Hose? Is this a hoax? It didn't feel like that was the case. Send a few men to disperse them? Maybe we're being too cautious, the mercenary leader mumbled. The situation called for everyone to speak their minds, and that was probably why he was mumbling loud enough to himself for the others to hear. Probably. Excuse me, sorry for butting in on your conversation, but can I say something? That's fine. As long as it's constructive suggestions, we can never have too many of those. First of all, this forest is well maintained, a cultivated forest. People let their pigs forage here or something. Aren't they just here to round up their pigs? If that's the case, if we were to disperse them, it might seem as though we are trying to steal their sounder of swine. We're flying the Sorcerer Kingdom's flag too. If a rumor was to circulate that the Sorcerer Kingdom is stealing pigs, wouldn't it be bad if that country found out? The mercenary leader sucked in his lips. Up to this point, they'd had their safety guaranteed by the flag. They had the right of way through some of the cities along the way and were treated with respect because of it, but now it seemed as though the grace of the Sorcerer Kingdom had turned into shackles instead. To bring shame upon the Sorcerer Kingdom would be to bring disaster upon themselves. That was why Christopher did not dare bring along any contraband for sale later on. You said there were a lot of them. How many is a lot? For a rough estimate, felt like there were around 50 men. I think that's too much manpower for simple farm work. What about you? He was the one to bring farm work up, but his parents were merchants too. Christopher had no experience raising pigs. No. I don't know if that's too many or too little. I have no idea how many people are necessary to catch a pig. Maybe they're here to plant more trees, or even cut down some. I heard there were also some types of farm work that require pigs or something. Well, if they brought hoes, then that would be more likely. Then, what about the noble of this land? Any tales of him working his serfs to death? Christopher kneaded his thick neck as he replied. No, I had seen him once in the past. He's pretty young, but also highly reliable. His domain has also been stable under his management. If he was to learn more about the etiquette of the aristocracy and political strategies, he would have a bright future ahead of himself. Though he didn't know him well, they'd shared conversations back when Christopher supplied alcohol to some tavern in the capital that was being funded by the Eight Fingers. It was unfortunate that Christopher had not been given a warrant of appointment, so he had never done business with that noble even when he had to pass through this section of road in his domain before. The lord here had potential worthy of Christopher's attention. In no way was he the type to mobilize villagers to attack caravans. From what Christopher could recall, there weren't many villagers in that man's domain who were hungry enough to attack a trade caravan, never mind 50 of them. There was a world of difference between him and the man introduced to Christopher by Hilma Signius. No, that man was simply unparalleled in his inferiority. Christopher couldn't help but suddenly tense up his forehead at the memory of being mistreated back then. Boss, even if they were to attack, they're only 50 unarmed and unarmored villagers. We should be able to defeat them easily. What are the chances that this is bait and there are more soldiers lying in wait for an ambush? The two mercenaries looked at each other upon hearing what their leader said. That's possible. Should we scout out our surroundings? If so, we'll need some time. Better safe than sorry, do it. Please don't take too long. If we deviate from the plans too much, I would have to march an army of wagons through the next time around to make up for the time we lost. Understood, just take a look around and return as soon as possible. The scout gave a nod and ran out. After around 10 minutes, he returned to report that other than the 50, there did not seem to be more waiting in ambush. They arrived at the conclusion that they must be there for farm work and continued on their way. Not even 5 minutes had passed before the carriage stopped again. Patron, I do apologize, but can I trouble you to come out for a second? the villagers have blocked our path. If they had any malicious intentions, we would have just rushed them to scare them off, but they seem to be indifferent, lethargic, or they just don't look right. So I was hoping that you could come out and talk to them? Of course, your safety is our #1 concern, so we prepared this shield for you. To tell the truth, Christopher really wanted to decline the mercenary's request. He did not believe in his own abilities. After all, he had avoided any and all violent confrontations throughout his life. But this wasn't something he could ignore. If they were to be embroiled in a dispute over what happened today, it could cost Christopher his access to this road. In that case, it wouldn't just impact him, but possibly also his children who will inherit his business. Yeah, let's go. Christopher and the mercenary leader stepped off the carriage together and walked towards the front of the entourage. They were escorted by mercenaries carrying a large shield known as a tower shield, which could cover half of his body during the negotiations. Furthermore, they were also followed by halberdiers who were there as a deterrent and archers who hid in the forest. Of course, the mercenary leader was also there. He had warned Christopher to listen carefully to his commands should a situation arise. Between the two sides of the forest on the road ahead of them sat a few chattering villagers. There was no mistaking it, they could only be villagers who were returning home after they had finished a day's worth of farm work. But if that was the case, why did they stop in the middle of the road to block them? Perhaps the mercenary leader had perceived Christopher's worries, as he started to mumble towards him in an attempt to initiate a conversation. Hey, pretty baffling, right? If they're planning to jump us, they should have split into two and hid in the forest or something. There are lots of ways to set up an ambush, but none of them would require you to show yourself in the middle of the road. No commander would be stupid enough to make such a mistake. Could it be that they're trying to scare us? Scare us? With their equipment? With those numbers? Wouldn't that be a serious insult to us if that were the case? Has my patron only employed mercenaries of such low levels before? It was just as he had said. Christopher did not bother replying but only stared towards the villagers. That said, the distance between them was huge and there were rows upon rows of mercenaries standing in front of them. I'm just a simple merchant who has accepted a transportation contract. If you're on the road to beg some noble or whatever, we do not want anything to do with that. Please vacate the road, otherwise we will be forced to bear arms against you all in the name of self-defense. A man appeared from the forest just as he had finished speaking to the villagers. The man had donned an exquisite set of full plate armor, but because he wasn't wearing his helmet, Christopher could see his face. It was someone Christopher had met before. Unfortunately, for the sake of the kingdom's future, I cannot allow you to pass. Christopher couldn't stop himself from vocalizing. It wasn't just him either, the mercenaries around him had made similar sounds too. I see. Looks like there has been some sort of a misunderstanding. We are just transporting the Sorcerer Kingdom's food aid to the Holy Kingdom. I knew it. I knew it. That's precisely why I'm doing this. What the fuck is this guy talking about? Or rather, what kind of thought process would lead you to that conclusion? Christopher was perplexed from the depths of his heart. But wait, it doesn't matter what this unpleasant fool thinks. I don't think his domain is even close to this place. Why is he here? Are they in cahoots? But would the lord of this land even bother working with this guy? Whatever. Christopher thought. The man had admitted guilt already, now Christopher could report back to his superiors that they were delayed by fools who were standing in the Sorcerer Kingdom's way. It shouldn't even be a problem with the kingdom or the Sorcerer Kingdom if they were to kill them all. Just as he was about to motion to the mercenaries around him to slaughter them, he felt a strong feeling that he shouldn't. The man they called Philip is a nobleman who has the backing of Hilma Signius. Christopher, who was humiliated and had to hide his anger beneath a fake smile back then, was told that though this man was moronic, he still had value, so it was best to just ignore his own humiliation. Would it be such a good idea to kill a valuable pawn of the 8 fingers? Speaking from common sense, there'd be no way a local noble would attack a caravan that was flying the Sorcerer Kingdom's flag. Everyone should know that it would just invite the Sorcerer Kingdom's wrath and spark all-out war between the nations. No matter how dumb a noble may be, they certainly wouldn't do something so brain-dead. If that was the case, what would his reason be to undertake such a task? Plus, if he was trying to pretend to be a bandit, he would at least cover up his face. I can't understand his reasoning. No matter how stupid someone could be, they should at least know that they should be concealing their identity in this situation. Since he was wearing that set of full plate armor, it should have come with a helmet that could cover his entire face. If that was the case, he wants us to see his face. He wants us to identify him as Philip? Why wow, Christopher was suddenly reminded of the existence of illusion magic. That's it. It's an illusion. Someone's trying to frame Philip so they faked his appearance. Maybe those villagers aren't villagers after all. He had managed to deduce it perfectly. Then. So, you're saying, you're robbing us specifically because we're carrying the Sorcerer Kingdom's grain. Is that correct? Patron, what's wrong? The mercenary leader who had been standing beside him asked with a perplexed expression. That was to be expected. He had expected an order to kill, so Christopher must have appeared to him like a madman. That's right. We'll be using these grains efficiently. The man, who was purportedly Philip, replied with pride. He's talking like a retard. The man pretending to be him must also be thinking why he'd have to say something so dumb. But could this be a pre-prepared script? But why? Christopher's first thought was of the rival organizations the mercenary leader had mentioned in their previous conversation. His next thought was of the leaders of the Eight Fingers. If it was the former, they had to get away from this place immediately. The Eight Fingers handed out the most ruthless punishments for those who had betrayed them, followed by those who had failed a job they had given to them. If the former was the case, then their opponents must have enough numbers to defeat Christopher's security detail. But even if they're just wearing disguises or whatever, Christopher couldn't think of a reason why there would be shovel-wielding villagers. Now that he thought about it, the latter felt more natural. If that was the case, then they're dealing with something truly troublesome, something extremely troublesome. This could imply that the leaders of the Eight Fingers were not as united as previously thought and were still attempting to sabotage each other. Or, was this the will of all of the leaders? Are we being thrown away? Are they trying to push the crime of killing Philip, a noble of the kingdom, onto me? His actual body might have already been dealt with. If that was the case, what would their next best move be? Hey, patron? What are we doing? Are you scared? You know that we can easily fight off someone like him, right? Though that noble-looking nutjob has some pretty impressive armor, he doesn't seem to have the skills to match. The mercenary leader spoke in a hushed tone. This wasn't the time for that, he shouldn't be interrupting Christopher's thoughts. Hold on. Just wait for a minute. Their problem wasn't going away. If they were pushing the job to kill Philip onto him, why didn't they mention it before? Had they told Christopher in advance, he wouldn't have to worry as much. He would have just taken care of that man as if he was just a normal bandit. So was their plan to make it out to be that a Sorcerer Kingdom's caravan had killed one of the kingdom's nobles, and bring the nations to the brink of war? This thought made Christopher uncontrollably tilt his head. As the situation stands, it was more like a merchant of the kingdom killing one of its nobles in self-defense. It would be hard to force a war on these conditions. Of course, Christopher, as someone who had deep connections to the criminal underworld, knew full well that many people wouldn't think twice about doing something as long as they had a reason prepared. There were also people who would kill for the simplest slight, but it was hard to imagine a country being this impulsive. Then there's only one possibility left. The top brass had decided on this already, but the word never got to me, so it's just a misunderstanding. After all, there would be no way they thought that it was possible for them to kill us all right now and not have news of it spread all over the place. Careless mistakes being made was a tale as old as time, so it wasn't as though that was an unreasonable assumption. What would be his best move from this point onward? If he were to take independent actions, there was a chance that he would be taken care of. If he wanted to avoid that kind of situation, he should have an excuse for himself at the very least. He should act in a way that makes it possible to shift responsibility to someone else. Killing that Philip guy would be the worst option. Once he's dead, we can't bring him back, and it would probably anger Signia-sama. If that's the case, leave the cargo, leave this place. If we did that, he wouldn't chase us, would he? Christopher tried his best to ignore the perplexed sounds coming out of the mercenary leader's mouth. Of course. I do not intend to harm the merchants of the kingdom. Even if it isn't directly, you're still harming me. Though those were his hate-filled thoughts, Christopher did not let it show on his face. Are you for real? Are you being serious right now? What's going on? What's happening? Are you under a spell? Or do you see an entire army I'm not seeing right now? This is an order from your patron, prepare for a full retreat. The mercenary leader rolled his eyes and got quiet for a moment. Perhaps he was considering the possibility that Christopher was under a spell, his own opinions, and his future. After a while, with an expression that said he couldn't accept any of this, he said, I understand. The mercenaries covered for Christopher as they backed away. He was allowing the grain to be taken away, but he knew the exact quantity and what exactly was in the cargo. If worse comes to worst, he could always repurchase the cargo and send it to the Holy Kingdom. They wouldn't be so picky as to only want this exact caravan of grain, right? Though he would have to apologize to the maritime merchant who was waiting on him, it was imperative for him to return to the capital to ask Signia-sama about this. Christopher knew from the depth of his heart that there was no easy way out of this situation. Was it because the merchants knew which side was in the right? They backed off without even unsheathing their swords. There were numerous wagons as their spoils of war. He had taken a look inside. They were all filled with barrels and crates, each filled to the brim with grain. Though it was all the types of grain that was easy to store and were by no means fresh, they should be safe for consumption. It was disappointing how it was just food. Philip wanted to take something as a trophy to commemorate his great achievement, but grain couldn't fulfill that purpose. If only there were sets of armor or swords in here, I could take one as a souvenir, so I really should have asked those men to leave their weapons behind. Philip looked over the cargo wagons that were his prize. The horses had been taken away already, so they did not have a way to move them. Of course, Philip had ordered them to leave the horses, but someone who looked like he led the mercenary group had refused his order. He even shot an arrow into the tree next to Philip back then. Though Philip hated his guts, he had no other option but to back down. I have my full plate armor, so I should be fine, but these soldiers aren't in the same boat as I am. How merciful am I to forfeit my own gains out of consideration for these people? Though, considering how everything had gone so well, not a single injury and not a single drop of blood spilt, I wanted to keep that up till the end. Philip surveyed his spoils and his gaze fell upon the flag of the Sorcerer Kingdom. I can keep this as a souvenir. The first to capture the flag of the Sorcerer Kingdom, the country that had defeated the kingdom's 200,000 strong army in battle, is me. Philip nodded his head. Though he wanted to hide his joy, he couldn't help but smile. A perfect conclusion suited him the best, as he thought, he was truly someone with exceptional abilities. This made him extremely happy. In front of him were the excellent fruits of his labor. Since there were multiple flags around, it should be fine if he did it to one of them right? After finishing that thought, Philip dropped the flag and began to stomp on it. The image of the Sorcerer Kingdom's flag being trampled in the dirt filled his heart with excitement. This wasn't something anyone else in the kingdom could accomplish. That's right, Philip had accomplished what no other man could. Look at that. I'm not a good-for-nothing after all. Compared to my brother, compared to my father, compared to everyone else in the kingdom. I'm truly the greatest. My lord. Can we really take these? Or is it better to leave them where they stand? One of the villagers checking the wagons asked timidly. With his excitement curbed, Philip asked, without masking his emotions, "What are you talking about?" "No, you see, won't those who ran away come back with soldiers?" "What do you mean? You think it would be better if we killed those merchants?" "No, I didn't mean that. Killing them would have been unnecessary." "Then what are you trying to say?" "My lord, what should we do about these? If we can take them back, how do we do that?" The other villagers chimed in. It was what was bothering Philip as well. What should we do? Even if he forced all 50 of them to carry it back all on their backs, it still wouldn't be enough to move all of their spoils back. The carriages themselves were also of high quality, so they could probably fetch a fair price, or Philip could just use them. But, with the manpower he has on hand, moving these back wouldn't be an easy task. It would be heavy, grueling physical labor. Right as Philip was agonizing over the matter, he heard the sound of people running on grass. Upon looking at the source of the sound, he saw the silhouettes of 2 masked men. "Philip!" It was Wayne's voice, but his equipment looked completely different from before. The dirty leather armor he had on was now replaced by a sturdy chest plate. He had a sword by his waist too. Why would he change his equipment? Philip felt doubt in his heart, but the feeling of excitement over the result of this operation was much stronger and thus overrode it. "Hey! You two! Come over here, look at our haul." What happened?" Wayne stood still, surveyed his surroundings, and spoke with an incredulous tone as if the cargo wagons being there was a strange sight to behold. Outside of regular combat and raids, once he considered that, Philip understood what questions Wayne had in mind. As if to affirm Philip's thoughts, Igor opened his mouth to ask. "Exactly. Looks like none of Philip's soldiers have been harmed. The ground looks fine, the air looks fine, not even a whiff of blood. What kind of tactic did you employ? Did you have on your person any special magical items?" If only he had any arcane talents, but that wasn't what Igor was talking about, was he? "None of that. After all, I've gathered a great number of men. The enemy simply did not want to fight to their deaths. I think." The two of them turned to face each other, but because both of them had their faces obscured, he couldn't see what their expressions were like. "Now then, how should we split this?" If he was being honest, the spoils of war in front of them were there entirely because of Philip's actions. It did irritate him somewhat that he had to split the prize with 2 people who had just been standing far back as spectators. However, if Philip were to take it all for himself, they would surely be unhappy too. After all, they also had to mobilize the villagers in their domains. 80% of the spoils should go to Philip, those 2 can take the rest of it. To take 1/10 of the spoils each just for mobilizing some villagers, there'd be no way they would want more, right? No need to worry about that. It doesn't sit right with us if we were to take a portion of the spoils without doing anything at all. Please, Philip, you should take it all. I trust that there aren't any objections? That's right, Philip should take it all, including the cargo wagons. Even someone like Philip would feel guilty to take it all after hearing such cordial words. Though they did say their villages were too small, so Philip couldn't stay there. The fact that they had set up camps near the forest and had prepared food for him meant that those favors must be repaid. Nonsense, nonsense. Aren't we partners? I would have to leave some of the spoils behind anyways, please feel free to use them. No, we have more than enough, Philip. Wayne replied without hesitation, not a single shred of doubt was present in his answer. These were all earned through Philip's efforts. As the etiquette of the nobility would dictate, we cannot accept these. Is that true? Yes, both of them answered simultaneously. They seemed to possess an unyielding will on this matter, so there was nothing he could do about it. This is all mine. Philip's heart fluttered at that thought. Since it has come down to this, I'll take it all. Also, though I'm embarrassed to ask, I do have a request for you too. Could I borrow some horses to pull these wagons? Horses? What should we do? We'll discuss this privately for a second, please excuse us. The two who had temporarily left his presence seemed to be exchanging their opinions, but from this distance it was hard to tell if they were talking at all. They seemed to reach an agreement after a while and promptly returned to Philip. We'll prepare the horses as soon as possible. However, because these aren't war horses but work horses, could you return them shortly after you're done with them? Thank you very much. An important thing to note, it would probably be best to lower the flags of the Sorcerer Kingdom. You wouldn't want to be seen by regular folks while transporting your spoils back, so though it will be difficult, please consider transporting them through the forest. Understood, I'll do that then. The two strode away as soon as they were done talking. Soon their silhouettes could no longer be seen in the forest. Philip surveyed the cargo wagons again. This was proof of his victory. They were as bright as his future. On the other hand, that which now rests underneath Philip's foot, the dirt-ridden flag of the Sorcerer Kingdom, was a representation of that country's eventual downfall. Ainz strode proudly through the streets of Irantal. Mammon walked alongside him. Needless to say, it was actually Pandora's actor. To match Mammon's appearance, he had been equipped with a set of full-plate armor and 2 greatswords, which hung on his back. His regal and austere gait had garnered him much praise and prestige. In fact, his version of Mammon appeared to be even more heroic than Ainz. To be honest, Ainz had considered asking him to adopt a worse gait in case the citizens were able to tell the difference between the different versions. Of course, this wasn't something he would actually say out loud, so he figured he could at the very least attempt to secretly copy his gait. To this end, he had been stealing glances at Pandora's actor from his side view, and fortunately, he hadn't appeared to have noticed yet. The one silently tailing those two to keep an eye out on their rear was Ainz Ooal Gown. Though it appeared that they did not have any bodyguards, in actuality, multiple Hanzos were hidden around them and were on alert. Consequently Ainz, whose level was lower than theirs, was largely redundant. However, considering how she had acted in this manner ever since she first debuted as Mammon's companion, Ainz felt it was unnecessary to order her to stop. It's important to note that these three were walking through the streets of this city without any goals in mind at all. It was just a familiar exercise for all. Through this procession with Mammon and Ainz, Ainz was able to demonstrate various different things to the crowd. It was also for this reason that Ainz hadn't brought the maids along. This act served multiple purposes. The most important of all was to validate the fact that Ainz was still working together with Mammon, so it wouldn't be appropriate to exclude Narbril from this operation. After all, Mammon was always seen in full-plate armor and his appearance wasn't known to many. So, had they not brought Narbril along, rumors would begin to circulate that Mammon was already killed by the Sorcerer King and it's actually an undead in that armor. In fact, those rumors had already begun circulating, so it was crucial for them to avoid creating further misunderstandings. The pedestrians all kept to the sides of the road as if it was a no-man's land upon spotting the trio's silhouettes. This was of course, mainly due to the Sorcerer King's presence. If Ainz had walked down these streets as Mammon, this wouldn't have happened. Though much time had passed between the founding of the Sorcerer Kingdom and now, the citizens were still terrified of Ainz. It wasn't just the humans who were reacting to him in that manner, but also some of the demi-humans too. This was because Irantal, which used to be a purely human-inhabited city, was no longer so. Demi-humans could be seen sprinkled throughout the crowds. If one were to look around where they would see the outlines of a number of demi-humans in the shops. They were both employees and customers, and sometimes they were even the owners of the store. The part of the city, which used to be a pauper's district, was renovated into residential zones for demi-humans under Ainz's orders. If they had been in that part of the city, this wouldn't be such an unusual sight to behold, but Ainz and the others were walking through one of the main streets of Irantal, far away from the slums of Ur. It was easy to see from this fact alone how there had been a considerable number of demi-humans flowing in and out of Irantal. Though this wasn't due to any special policies Ainz had put in place, After all, the one who had been putting effort into these matters was Albedo. He still felt proud of this fact. It told him that his plans to unify the races were progressing at a steady pace. If this was the case, I would really like to enact policies that could speed up the process of uniting them all. In fact, he had such a plan in mind already. Ainz had considered holding some sort of an event in Irantal with the ulterior motive to draw in more tourists and increase their income from foreign sources. What he hadn't considered was how unfestive and non-participatory this world was in general, which was the cause of his boredom this entire time. Though a gladiatorial arena like the one in the Empire wouldn't be too bad, Ainz wanted something that hadn't been done already, something truly special. If he were to hold a large event that involved audience participation or anything that would allow an interracial team to shine, that would surely boost racial unity. If people had something in common to talk about, surely it would be easier for them to get along. How about some kind of ball-based sport like baseball or football? Or should I do something to spice up an existing event? As he mulled over those issues, Ainz was also observing an orc shopkeeper who appeared to be in a serious discussion with their human customers. They were probably part of the orcs he had encountered in the Holy Kingdom, the ones who had been devastated by the evil Lord of Wrath and were then unified under Ainz. He couldn't recall any other time he had brought orcs to Irantal. Who this orc was exactly, Ainz had no clue. Though he had incorporated a large number of orcs into his dominion, the main reason was because Ainz, as one with human sensibilities, could not tell orcs apart at all. In a similar vein, he couldn't tell apart members of the other races either. For example, female Zerns differentiated themselves by their color. Speaking of Zerns, he couldn't help but wonder, how do they see anyways? In any case, they all looked about the same to Ainz. This issue was applicable to most people anyways. It was equally as difficult for an orc to differentiate between two humans as it was for a human to differentiate between two orcs. For this reason, they had stuck to recognizing humans through features like hair length, pupil colors, etc., but incidents still arose whereby goods reserved for a specific person were sold to someone who looked similar, even though to someone like Ainz the two persons looked completely different. The Sorcerer Kingdom had no issues with public order. Crime rates for misdemeanors were low, never mind felonies. This, however, wasn't due to the strict enforcement of the law, but rather out of people's fears that their corpses would be turned undead to serve the country after their deaths. It was for this reason that misunderstandings were cleared up quickly and without much fuss. Mountains weren't being made out of molehills. This was why the orc was calmly discussing business with his human customers. The Adventurers Guild has also started accepting demi-humans amongst their ranks. I believe that all of the demi-humans will be able to reach their potential in the foreseeable future. Ainz said under his breath without much thought, prompting Pandora's actor to reply, Ainz-sama, it is exactly as you have surmised. Those demi-humans, upon witnessing the undead Ainz-sama had created, must have thought that the career of a common soldier was no longer feasible. Those with talents in the arts, manufacturing, and research would then be more inclined to utilize said talents to their maximum potential. The Sorcerer Kingdom was still following the system of, your race is pretty good at this, so you should probably seek employment in this field. However, as the citizens' knowledge of the other races and their respective cultures increases, they would probably begin to desire various other professions. Though this change was still in its early phases, the desire for self-determination would surely blossom over time. The main drive for this change was the fact that all menial labor was now handled by the undead. Albedo seems to be managing that sector of the country well. After all, it's imperative for us to halt the development of problematic crafts. Ainz and the rest were already at their level caps, so it was necessary to plan against those who were weaker than them and thus had the potential to become stronger. As part of those plans, they couldn't allow their own people to achieve superiority in expertise over them. Weaklings should remain weaklings. At the same time, they had to ensure that the supremacy of their country as a whole was well maintained against their neighboring countries. Perhaps Albedo was the only one who could possibly maintain this delicate balance. To this end, we're in desperate need of spies capable of obtaining top-secret intel from our neighbors. We're still too weak on that front. To create a pop monster that Nazarick would not automatically respawn required two ingredients. One was the monster's data and the other was the corresponding amount of gold coins from Yggdrasil. Though the library of Nazarick contained data on various types of monsters, it did not contain the data of every single type of monster from Yggdrasil. Some monsters' data were of limited use too. For example, they had already exhausted their supply of data on Hanzos, and the library did not contain any data for the creation of 8-edge assassins. The creation of higher-tiered monsters incurred the cost of a large sum of gold. If that was the case, shouldn't weaker monsters suffice? Though he wanted to say so, actually using them would mean that there would be a higher chance of them getting caught whenever they tried to infiltrate someplace. Amongst the surrounding nations, it wasn't inconceivable to think that they weren't the only ones capable of employing monsters. It would be best for them to use higher-tiered monsters who were harder for others to detect while their country was still of modest size. Or maybe, human spies? Ainz accidentally spoke his thoughts out loud. Nabe, upon hearing him speak, walked closer behind him to say, Ainz Sama. Speaking of which, how has the training for those spies been going? Shall I make sure those sows know who their rightful master is? Ainz lowered his voice and responded with, Nabe. You're the partner of the folk hero Mammon now, do not forget your position. After all, they had made it out to be that Mammon and Nabe had been bound to this city out of concern for the safety of its inhabitants, which was why they were working with Ainz Ooal Gown in the first place. Perhaps enough time had passed that it wouldn't be too bad to have their characters have a change of heart so that they were staying in the city out of reverence for the Sorcerer King instead. That being said, it would be safer to discuss this matter in advance with Albedo and the others to formulate a better script before committing to anything. Until then, it was best to not make suggestions to Ainz directly. It was better to discuss these matters within Nazarick and avoid those topics entirely while outside. I profusely apologize. You have been forgiven, would have been what he would have said, until he took a good look at their surroundings. A lot of people were watching intently with horrified expressions, hopefully they hadn't heard what Nabe had said. Ultimately, it wouldn't have been feasible for him to kill them all out of the suspicion of what they might have overheard. Otherwise, the facade he had built up that he was a unique undead capable of speech who was different from the other members of his kind would be harder to maintain. Nonetheless, ignoring Nabe's question and causing her to put on a dismayed expression caused Ainz to feel pity for her. It would be troublesome if she were to stop asking questions of her own entirely. With that in mind, Ainz muttered his answer in a volume that was incomprehensible to those around them, We've lent out the Hanzos. Tira is currently in charge of training the human spies, but if I'm being honest, all of them combined are no better than a single 8-edge assassin, just consider it an investment for the future. Though it was unlikely that they would receive a return on investment proportional to the gold and time they had invested into this program, it wasn't as though it was completely impossible. The same applied to their investments in runecraft and other magical technologies. They were going in completely blind on whether or not those efforts would bear fruit, so it would be best to dial back their investments down to a minimum for now. Ainz stopped talking. And just like that, the trio continued to walk down the street in silence. Occasionally, they would bump into patrol teams consisting of death knights, death wizards, death warriors, death priests, and death assassins. Though they were walking on the streets too, they maintained a tight formation with the death assassins silently keeping a lookout on the front. This wasn't due to any perceivable dangers, but rather the fact that they were just following their original orders to patrol in formation. Something of note was that though death assassins were bad at concealing themselves, they had a high damage output thanks to their high critical strike chance. If an enemy were to let their guard down because they believed that a death assassin did not pose a threat to them, then they would be able to deal an alarming amount of damage. This was why Ainz couldn't make spies out of him. Even though we're exporting undead, those exports mostly consisted of weak skeletons. Of course, they were charging vastly different prices for weaker undead compared to the stronger ones, so the most popular product was still those designed for cheap menial labor. Consequently, the amount of undead around the level of a Death Knight they had exported was minimal. It would be a waste to not use up his daily limit of create undead, so Ainz had been exhausting his daily use abilities. As a result, the number of undead he had created had already become a nuisance to him. If I were to lower their rental costs and raise them in the future, no one would rent from us again. Plus I don't want to cut prices directly. Should I create a rewards system? The Empire rented quite a lot of Death Cavaliers from us, so we should probably focus on marketing to nations directly, but... Ainz glanced at Pandora's actor, who was beside him. It's kind of awkward to just walk like this in silence. But there's not really much I'd want to talk to him about. If people were to perceive that their relationship wasn't so great after all, then there wouldn't be a point to this exercise. Miss Nabe. A conversation with Pandora's actor would be insufferable, so Ainz chose to speak to Nabe instead. Yes. Hold up, you don't have to answer with such vigor, you know? Ainz thought, but did not bother to say out loud. Her actions weren't so strange in hindsight. When all was said and done, they were essentially subordinates under Ainz. How should I say this? How's Yuri's orphanage? Have you visited yet? No, I haven't been there yet. And that was the end of their conversation. That couldn't be because she had a bad relationship with Yuri, but just that she had no interest in that matter, right? Wait a second, would someone really be so disinterested in the workplace of someone whose existence was their closest analog to family? But that response was also to be expected from Narberl. Would she have reacted in the same way if the question had been about Shizu or Intoma's workplace? Ainz shrugged as that thought came up. Shall we visit it then? Because the full responsibility for the orphanage had been given to Yuri, not even Ainz knew of its current status. Of course, he had been given detailed plans about it, but no memory of it remained in Ainz's vacuous, bony head. There should have also been some scheduled reports on the finances of the orphanage, but since Ainz had been delegating those responsibilities to Albedo, he had only pretended to have read those reports. Though he had advocated for talent scouting through the education sector, the Sorcerer Kingdom had yet to implement the as of now unrealistic policy of universal education for all. If the level of education rose, so will technological and cultural advancements, but it could also strengthen weaklings. Though their current policies may lead to some people with undiscovered talents to stay as farmers for the rest of their lives, Nazarik's peace was their top priority. I don't think that's a bad idea. After Pandora's actor agreed, the trio began walking in another direction led by Narberl. Not even 2 minutes had passed before Ainz received a message. Ainz-sama. Intoma? What's going on? Ainz walked as he talked and felt rather inauspicious. He couldn't remember the last time he had received a message like this in the past year, so it must have been some kind of emergency. But Ainz's fearless smile never wavered. The whole ordeal in the Holy Kingdom was such a pain that nothing could be worse in comparison. Compared to the hell I had to go through, nothing this world could throw at me is undoable. The request, as he had expected, was for him to return to Nazarik immediately. After replying that he would do so, Ainz instructed Narberl to bring the rest of the maids back to Nazarik too. He opened up a gate after bidding his farewells to the two to allow the Hanzos who had been securing their perimeter to go back. Only then did Ainz return to Nazarik himself. After dismissing the Hanzos, he took the ring of Ainz Ooal Gown from Solution, who had welcomed him back. Using the ring, he teleported to the 10th floor and began to walk towards the room that was his destination. The rooms that were either important or special in Nazarik had all been marked so that one could teleport straight to their doors with the ring. This was not the case with rooms that had been deemed as normal from the start, and thus one could not teleport straight to them. This could be seen as the only flaw of the ring that allowed its user to teleport freely within Nazarik, but it was no longer possible for them to modify its functions. If they still had the Yggdrasil creator kits around, it could be possible, but neither Ainz nor Nazarik's inventory had any. Albedo stood in front of the door to Ainz's destination, awaiting his arrival. Ainz did not probe how long she had been waiting there, but only about the progress she had made on her assigned tasks. "You've been working hard, thank you. I'm not worthy of your praise." Ainz sighed on the inside as he witnessed Albedo deeply lowering her head. Though he had said that he would return immediately, he had not given them a specific time frame. The thought that he could have wasted Albedo's time by making her wait unsettled Ainz. He did not and could not let those thoughts show on his face. This had happened several times before. Despite telling Albedo that there was no need for her to wait for him each time, she had always insisted, saying that it was natural for a servant to welcome her master's return. In fact, he had talked about this with not just the floor guardians, but the area guardians and the maids too. Every time he brought it up, their responses would be the same as the one Albedo was giving him right now. The maids were especially enthusiastic with their answers, demonstrating a level of determination that could even make someone like Ainz cower and apologize. If this was the general consensus, then Ainz, as their overlord, had to forego his personal opinions on the matter. Albedo opened the door to the room and welcomed Ainz in. Ainz believed that he was not a man outstanding enough to be worthy of such treatment, and with great guilt, he put on the facade that this was all to be expected and walked into the room before her. Shaltir, Kokyutos, Aura and Mare, and Demiurge. The floor guardians had already been gathered in this room and were all bowing towards the throne that somehow radiated darkness. Behind the throne hung the flag of the sorcerer kingdom of Ainz Ooal Gown. It looked like everybody who was supposed to be here was already here. In cases such as this, where all hands were on deck, Ainz had to be the last one to arrive according to procedures. Unless it was for a special occasion, no one would arrive later than him. Ainz surveyed the overburdened guardians in front of him. Every floor guardian had been entrusted with their own set of duties in the past, but recently the scope of their work had increased by a wide margin. The air transportation system that mainly relied on flying monsters had established a transportation network between the Sorcerer Kingdom, the Empire, the Dwarven Kingdom, and the desolate, demi-human inhabited region to the east of the Holy Kingdom. The one who was placed in charge of this network, Shaltir, now had the responsibility to utilize her skills to gradually establish a land-based transportation network. The one in charge of controlling the weather in the territories and building an underground tomb on the outskirts of Urantal, Mare, was also working alongside the newly established Adventurers Guild. The one in charge of commanding, managing, and training the Sorcerer Kingdom's army, which consisted mostly of the undead but also included various types of demi-humans and a small number of humans, was Kokyutos. The one who used to only have to command her own magical beasts, but now had to operate a department which deployed a warning net that provided adequate coverage over the ever-increasing boundaries of the Sorcerer Kingdom's territories, was Aura. The one who was establishing an intelligence agency on the 7th floor of Nazarik was Demiurge. Just like that, the responsibilities of each floor guardian grew over time. Which was why there were plans to shift some of those responsibilities to those who up till that point had only been concerned with the internal defense of Nazarik, the area guardians. Needless to say, the one who was in charge of checking up on everybody's progress, receiving requests or suggestions, and approving the various affairs of the Sorcerer Kingdom, the Guardian Overseer Albedo, had been the busiest of them all. The truth was, no one was as idle as Ainz. His daily duties amounted to simply practicing acting more like an overlord. It was a deeply embarrassing fact to admit. So basically, he had been summoned for something that those who were occupied by the most important tasks had deemed to require his presence. Ainz strode in a dignified manner through the center of the room. Albedo shut the doors behind them and followed closely behind him. He sat on the only seat in the room. Albedo took a knee in front of him and said, "Ainz Sama. The floor guardians of every floor have arrived." "What do you mean, they have arrived?" "They were here already." Of course, Ainz did not and could not say that out loud. You floor guardians have been working hard. Raise your heads. Yes. The guardians raised their heads as they gave their crisp answers, an action that was both flawless and in unison. Originally, Albedo had been the one to ask them to raise their heads, but Ainz had decided to put an end to that. Though it had been said that a superior shouldn't talk so easily to their subordinates, Ainz did not want to distance himself from them that much. The guardians' gaze, which made apparent their absolute loyalty, all fell on Ainz's body. In the past, Ainz couldn't handle this kind of attention, but his skin had grown thick in the intervening times to the point that it did not affect him in the slightest these days. But, why? Am I getting the wrong impression, or do they feel even more loyal than they were before? No, it has to be the wrong impression, right? Ainz, who couldn't recall doing anything that could have raised their loyalty, avoided the welcoming gazes of the guardians to randomly scan the room he was in. This wasn't because he couldn't handle their gazes, but he did it anyway. On both sides of the room were doors that were dissimilar to the one they had just walked through, doors that were not warranted given the relatively small size of the room. The room was just decorated in such an exquisite manner that it emanated an air of grandeur. It was set up to be the audience room within Nazarick. Another was set up in Irantal. Nazarick's throne room was glorious, but it was too spacious and would feel empty if not enough people were gathered inside. He could gather enough people if he wanted to, but considering problems such as the presence of a world-class item, something that was among Nazarick's strongest assets, and thus could not casually be seen by others, an audience room was built. Everything in Nazarick was made by its guild members in the past, except this audience room. Under Ainz's orders, the floor guardians had put great consideration into refitting an empty room for this exact purpose. It made Ainz quite happy. NPCs, made by the guild members, had grown beyond being mere NPCs. It was as though they had become players. There will always come a day when the chicks leave their nest to fly on their own. Ainz smiled mentally. Every one of them had made him proud. Suzuki Satoru had no children and not many of the other guild members did either. He wasn't sure, but perhaps this was what it was like to be a father. At any rate, this was not what it would be like to be a mother, probably. He immersed himself in his own thoughts for a bit. However, no one would speak until he had spoken, so he was forced to despite not being the MC or something similar. So, Albedo, tell me the reason why everyone was gathered here. It's something important to Nazarick, or rather, to the Sorcerer Kingdom, right? Yes. Simply put, our grain that was being transported through the kingdom towards the Holy Kingdom was plundered 4 days ago. And who did that? A noble of the kingdom. The light in Ainz's eyes flashed for a moment. Albedo was being vague. Normally, she would report the name, military power, and goal of the noble all at once. Why is that? Ainz thought about it as he asked further. Did the Eight Fingers merchant in charge of transportation not have soldiers guard the caravans? Moreover, the rule was that our flag should have been flown, yes? Which meant the kingdom had chosen to start a war with us. He had thought, judging by the kingdom's actions, that they were trying to avoid a war, but it now seemed to be an incorrect judgment. Or, was the incident itself some kind of strategy? Ainz took notice of another possibility as his thoughts developed. Could it be that the Eight Fingers had betrayed us? No, well, Albedo lowered her head as she muttered, she then glanced at Ainz as if she were trying to sneak a peek. Ainz thought that her current attitude was quite rare. Rather, this might have been the first time she has ever shown this kind of behavior. She was behaving like a little girl who was afraid of getting scolded, definitely unlike the overseer she had always been. What's wrong, Albedo? Is something the matter? Ainz carefully maintained his dignified facade and felt as if his back was soaked with sweat. Ainz, of course, could not sweat. Was it because of a mistake Ainz had made? If that was the case, then Albedo's response would make sense. She was behaving like an employee who'd had to point out the mistakes her boss had made that messed everything up, A noble of the kingdom? I have no idea. Did I do something? I didn't do anything funny in the past few months, did I? No, could I? As Ainz, who couldn't even remember the documents he had stamped a few weeks ago, thought about it, it felt more and more like it was a mistake of his own. His anxiety grew alongside his thoughts. No, wait. I got it. I got it. Didn't I tell Albedo and Demiurge during the Holy Kingdom thing? And I told a lot of people the same thing after coming back. Yes, I made a mistake deliberately. Past me, you're great. Wait, now is the time to use that excuse. Ainz had always thought that the title of an absolute overlord was too much for him to bear. It was about time for him to take it off. He had a cordial smile on his face. Don't worry about it, Albedo. Tell me about it. Yes. Ainz-sama. Surely you remember our plan to make use of an idiotic noble for the purpose of gaining control over the kingdom. Ainz raised a question in his mind. What she said was not what he had expected, but at this point Ainz knew what to say. That fool had something to do with it? Albedo nodded, yes. That dimwit had caused this incident. Ainz-sama has probably realized by now the possibility that this could be a scheme of the kingdom's ruling class. More misunderstandings? Ainz started thinking. He couldn't see the deeper aspects of such a scheme, but it was probably beneficial to the kingdom to convict a noble associated with Nazarick. That way, they could purge a pest from their ranks. I understand, but does the blame truly lie with that imbecile? It's not some ploy by the kingdom, is it? Wait, Albedo must have investigated the intel already. Sorry for unnecessary questions. No, those questions were only natural for you to ask, Ainz-sama. We have prepared a witness for this purpose. Shaltir. Understood. Shaltir curtsied, stood up, and then left through the left door. Right after that, a woman held on both sides by Death Knights returned with Shaltir. She was so thin her bones were visible as if she were sick. She also had heavy bags under her eyes, did not wear any makeup, and had messy hair. Tear stains could be seen around her bloodshot eyes, which darted around uncontrollably like a terrified, tiny creature. Ainz remembered seeing that person somewhere, but he couldn't recall important details like her name and position. As he tried his best to search through his memories, the Death Knights let go of her. The woman knelt down in one smooth movement. It was flawless, one could even say that it was beautiful. It was something that was only possible through a suitable amount of training. Ainz even felt a bit of respect for her because of that. Your Majesty, her voice was trembling a lot. She paused for a moment, then spoke again, Your Majesty. The room fell silent. Realizing that it was his turn to speak, Ainz said in a deep voice, Woman, I permit you to speak your name. Hilma Sigmius, Your Majesty. His reawakened memories spread like vines. She was one of the leaders of the Eight Fingers, the kingdom's crime syndicate. It was not known how she understood the noise that Ainz had made subconsciously. Hilma, who had not raised her head even once, yelled as her forehead rubbed against the floor. I have no idea. No idea. I have absolutely no intention of disobedience. The grain robbery has nothing to do with me. Ainz took a glimpse at Albedo's back. It would be incredibly easy to determine if the woman had lied, so Albedo must have done so. So why did she not report the results directly to Ainz? Ainz didn't know what Albedo was thinking, but it certainly wasn't about stabbing him in the back. Actually, it was probably the opposite. There was some unknown misunderstanding that was born of her holding Ainz in too high of a regard. It would not be appropriate to ask her about it directly. I got myself into this situation because I repeatedly performed as my persona, didn't I? Albedo won't understand if this continues on. Should I ask and see what happens? It would have been fine if Albedo was the only one who was here, but the others are also here. Ainz looked at Aura and Mare. Next time, I guess. First of all, let me confirm if Sigmius was telling the truth. dominate. After the spell had been cast, Ainz asked Signius, "Did you play any role in that noble robbing our grain convoy?" "None whatsoever." A dominated individual could not lie to their dominator, which meant that Signius had no direct connections to the incident. Though an indirect connection was still possible, it wouldn't have made it her responsibility. The hypothetical that she had been lying by ways of memory manipulation was unlikely. "Have you been described by others as having multiple personalities?" "No." "Then do you wish to oppose us?" "Not at all." "I don't have the slightest intention to." "Absolutely not." She denied with her fiercest tone yet. Bearing witness to this, Ainz released her from his dominate. If we were to punish her based on a crime she wasn't purposely responsible for would be too harsh. Signius, not guilty. That's my ruling. Signius raised her head and gazed towards Ainz with a brilliant passion within her eyes, to the point where Ainz found it to be terrifying. "But, Ainz-sama, shouldn't the faults of a subordinate be the responsibility of their superiors?" "That cretin was her responsibility." Albedo was right. You're absolutely correct. But he took those actions randomly and of his own accord. I had instructed him multiple times. "Contact me before you do anything." I had even appointed a subordinate to monitor him for this exact reason. Albedo did not object to her explanation. So that was the truth. She had performed her duties to the utmost, so it would be too cruel to let her shoulder the full responsibility for this incident. Albedo, Human Resources, had hired a simpleton who caused major issues in Signius, the department. Though it's obvious that there were issues within that department, Ainz also understood the tendency to want to blame this on HR. Ainz, the salaryman, thought about this issue from Signius' perspective. If he were to leave this matter to Albedo and the others, they would surely dish out severe punishments to her. Then, the faults of a subordinate are the responsibility of their superior. I concur with that statement. Ainz watched as the color drained from Hilma's face and continued, "But, that proverb was said by a leader who wished to shoulder the burden of their subordinate. It was not meant as a way for subordinates to shift blame onto their superiors." As for how encompassing the statement could be, Albedo, let me ask you a question. Signius was in charge of that dunce, but who was in charge of Signius? That's my responsibility. And I am your master, so the responsibility for this incident falls on me in the end, correct? We wouldn't dare. This is absolutely not the fault of Ainz-sama. Albedo disavowed his statement with an uncharacteristically panicked expression. Signius, whose expression just a moment prior had been one foretelling of their own doom, now gazed upon Ainz with the same spark in her eyes as before. Her face was almost ever-changing. Though Signius' modus operandi may be flawed, she had performed according to the expectations of her office. For that, she has been forgiven. The first time an error occurs, it is because everyone makes mistakes. The second time around it would be the result of carelessness. The third time should have been avoidable. The fourth time is the one to indicate one's incompetence. Signius. Yes. Signius lowered her head so much that it made an audible impact with the floor. It looked painful even from an outside perspective. To prevent a similar incident from occurring again, work harder on your preventative measures. Prepare a set of all of the plans you could think up of, submit them to Albedo, and wait for approval. That will be your punishment. Yes. Signius rubbed her head against the ground, as if she was trying to lower her head even further. That seems unnecessary. Ainz thought as he turned to look towards the guardians. That is my decision. Do you have any comments? I will not get angry, so you are free to speak your minds. No one seemed to have objections. Still, every one of them was capable of saying Ainz-sama's decisions are always correct with a straight face even if they had any dissenting opinions, so it wasn't likely that they would give voice to those opinions. In any case, it was better to confirm than not. Albedo. No objections. Demiurge. I concur with Albedo. Aura. None. Mayor, yes. I don't have any objections. Cocyutos. No. Objections. Shaltir. None. Were they really fine with it, or were they too afraid to speak up? Ainz wasn't sure, but he had at least received their approval. Ainz forcefully nodded his head and made his judgment final. Good. Now then, Signius. Prepare those plans within a few days, that is, have them ready within 2 days. Signius audibly whipped her head upwards. Understood. I'm grateful for my lord's merciful judgment. I thank you from the deepest depths of my heart. O Sorcerer King Haika. Please allow me, Hilma Signius, to continue loyally serving you from now on. Is that so? Signius' almost revolting amount of passion reminded him of a girl he had met in the past with scary-looking eyes. I look forward to your loyal service. Now then, Shaltir, please send Signius back. Understood. Shaltir took Hilma along as she activated her ring's function. The destination of their teleportation was the surface. She should be using gate afterwards, so it shouldn't take too long. With that in mind, they waited in place for her. Not too long after, Shaltir returned alone as he had expected. Now then, that couldn't be the only reason I was called here for, right? If that was the only reason why, then he would be thanking his lucky stars, but that wish was shattered by Albedo. Yes, it is exactly as you have surmised. Ainz looked at Albedo as if he had held a grudge against her. He would have loved it if she had only let him hold on to that hope for just a while longer. Is something wrong? Perhaps just then. No, nothing's wrong. Now then, how about you tell me the true purpose behind you calling me, gathering every floor guardian here? Albedo and Demiurge exchanged glances upon being asked. First on the docket, for what purpose did that buffoon undertake his actions? Was someone manipulating him as part of their ploy? That is certainly possible. Depending on the answer to those questions, we may have to significantly revise our plans against the kingdom. For that it would be nice to know what Ainz Ooal's thoughts are on the matter, so I proposed that we ask for your presence. As of now, our strategy against the kingdom had been candy and whip, hadn't it? Have you explained the concept to Aura, Mare, Cocyutos, and Shaltir before? Demiurge and I were in the process of doing so, but we have yet to explain the specific details of the plan. Is that so? Then, Albedo, please share the intel with everybody. Any suggestions or opinions from you all could be helpful. Understood. Albedo began her explanation to the 4 of them. The candy and whip strategy to prepare the kingdom for a takeover was in essence a plan to destabilize the kingdom from the inside to the point where a portion of the kingdom's citizens would actively hope for peaceful foreign intervention by the Sorcerer Kingdom. Was it because Demiurge was also involved in the planning process? The plan began sounding more and more like what they had done in the Holy Kingdom. It was a strategy that depended on internal conflicts and would thus cause a massive loss of life at the start. His preference for internal conflicts over physically invading a country was probably due to him being a fiend. If Cocyutos or Shaltir were in charge of planning, they would probably prefer more direct methods such as a full-blown invasion. But apparently this plan had been formulated by someone within the kingdom, and Albedo and Demiurge had only made slight modifications on top of the original. That imbecile of a noble was a crucial element of this strategy. He was meant to start a revolution. In conjunction with the internal conflicts initiated by their grain shortage, the kingdom would then be forced to request aid from the Sorcerer Kingdom. There were multiple ways to make use of the nobility, but they would all create a reason for the Sorcerer Kingdom to intervene in the kingdom's affairs. This meant that to Ainz, everything was still going according to plan. The incident caused by that dimwit was more than enough justification for the Sorcerer Kingdom to involve themselves. However, it appeared as though Albedo and Demiurge were a bit worried by the current situation. There had to be something that Ainz was missing. Now then, Albedo. Though I want to ask questions of a fundamental nature. Do we actually have evidence that Noble caused the incident? Do we have clues that this was a ploy by the kingdom? I recall something about Albedo's scheduled correspondence with that noble we were supposed to get under our influences. Albedo had complained to Ainz time after time about having to send letters to that unpleasant noble, a mere human, or something similar. She had also requested Ainz to review said letters, so he had to read them on numerous occasions. If it was simple paperwork, Ainz would still know a bit about it, but he had no confidence in his ability to proofread or edit. He tried to avoid having to do so, but Albedo had begged him in earnest, so he had to. By the way, though much time had passed since he came to this world, Ainz still hadn't learned to read the language. The best he could do was write out his and Mamon's names and recognize numbers. Compared to Albedo, Demiurge, and Pandora's actor, who understood the language of several countries, it was easy to see how their brains functioned on a completely different level than his. It was for this reason that Ainz had to rely on magical items to understand any texts. If he was being honest, he didn't think any edits would be necessary, so he just handed them back as is to Albedo. I've also seen the letters that Noble had sent back in response, and frankly, it appears as though he was completely charmed by you. I did not think that he would be the type to oppose the Sorcerer Kingdom. He had heard of a saying that betrayal from one's crush could lead one to become irrationally hateful. Like finding out the cute voice actor you stan had a boyfriend. As this thought came to mind, Ainz could see a reflection of his friend of yesteryear, crying tears of blood in Shaltir's place. He could also see in Aura and Mare's place, that friend's sister, laughing at him. Yes, we've conducted detailed investigations into this matter. It is undeniably true that that man was the mastermind behind the grain robbery. But, the possibility that he could have been charmed, brainwashed, or controlled in any other way is certainly not zero. The only thing we could be sure of is that he had committed the crime. Perhaps this was a ploy by someone of an even higher intellect than us. If that was the case, then there is the possibility that they are somehow taking advantage of his actions. Albedo had a troubled expression, and so did Demiurge. What Ainz found unbelievable was the possibility that someone who could rival the intellect of these two would just show up out of the blue. Or rather, maybe that nobleman did what he did without thinking it through. If that was the case, then it would make a lot more sense to Ainz. Ainz-sama, I don't believe that's possible, Albedo said in a tone as if she were apologizing. This was the first time she had adopted such an attitude, and Ainz couldn't help but feel refreshed from this new kind of behavior. No, wait a second, Albedo. We are only able to make preemptive moves against the strategies of some genius, but Ainz-sama could even see through an idiot's rash actions. There's always the possibility that it could be the case, is there not? No, isn't that explanation the most plausible? But, to be that stupid, is it really possible? But Ainz-sama, if Ainz-sama said so, then isn't it the truth? Albedo. I guess so. I think, for some reason Aura and Mare had butted in to back up Demiurge's argument, stunning Ainz, who had simply muttered a throwaway comment. If that's the case, Albedo and Demiurge furrowed their brows and began to debate. Hold on a second. Let's hear the opinions of the other floor guardians regarding the operation. They must have quite a lot of questions, so let's set aside some time for that. Those of you with questions could just raise your hands, and Albedo or Demiurge will answer them. Please don't direct any questions at me. Ainz had put up a white flag in his mind already. I have a question, Aura said as she raised her hand. Why didn't we just draw in as many of the nobility as we could at the start of the operation? If we did that, we could just kill off that troublesome noble and continue the operation as we had planned, right? The one to answer this question was Demiurge. We had considered that during the planning phase, but ultimately chose to abandon that idea after deliberations. It would have been fine had we drawn an outstanding nobleman, but the nobles of the kingdom aren't exactly known for their intellect, now are they? With that in mind, the more people we drew into the fold, the more likely it was for an unexpected leak in intel to occur. That was why we had decided to focus on an individual and have them form and manage a new faction. Things were the way they were because they hadn't expected that person to be such a wild card. The next one to raise their hand was Kokyudos. We could not make use of the exceptional nobles? It wasn't as though we couldn't. In fact, we had recruited someone like that already. It's so easy to blackmail a doting father. We had considered the fact that we would want to spare the noblemen who were at least somewhat capable, which was why we chose the expendable portion of the nobility. Don't you believe that it's necessary for us to clear out the moronic few so that the country could become one worthy of being ruled over by Ainz Ooal? That was why we formed a faction that was filled with people that were incompetent in various forms. As a metaphor, think of it as preparing a rubbish bin before throwing away trash. Of course, we had received intel on the talented people of the kingdom, but we wanted to also collect intel of our own directly from the source. Because the Sorcerer Kingdom has no need for nobles other than a few of them who are either talented or hardworking ascetics. I have a question, Shaltir said as she raised her hand. I'm not sure I understand. Even if that dolt of a nobleman was being manipulated into doing what he did his actions not constitute an attack against the Sorcerer Kingdom? If so, shouldn't the Sorcerer Kingdom use that as casus belli to invade the kingdom? If it really was a trap set by someone, could we not just crush them? That is correct, we should have done so, especially if there were no hidden masterminds, but... Albedo glanced at Demiurge, prompting him to answer, that's right. Demiurge then turned his gaze towards Ainz, before looking towards the Guardians. It is extremely difficult to find the right balance in dealing with the situation. Though now that we have Ainz Ooal's superior insight, we've come to understand that the nobleman had committed this act without putting much thought into it. If we were to lightly punish him for this transgression, the Sorcerer Kingdom will be looked down upon by other nations. So, what do you all believe is the suitable punishment for someone who had attacked a caravan flying the Sorcerer Kingdom's flag, something that essentially signified Ainz Ooal himself, and had stained Ainz Ooal's public image? We should kill him. Yeah, I think Wanichan is correct. That's right. That's how it should be. Now then, I must ask you all. Do we simply let this slide after we have dealt with the criminal himself? That will not do. His master must also answer for this crime. Kokyudos nodded his head in silence. Ainz had never been more shocked than he was at this moment. Though it was surprising that the Guardians would have such an overreaction, it wasn't too out of the ordinary, considering their personalities. What Ainz was shocked about was how they had accepted his throwaway comment about the noble as the truth at face value. To be honest, it was quite scary. That's right, I also agree with Shaltir's judgment. For them to be dumb enough to make a fool out of Ainz Ooal, I say we need to mete out appropriate punishments to the entire kingdom. But, back then, Ainz Ooal once said that to rule over a ruined nation would be bad for our reputation. I've also heard that Ainz Ooal has no interest in standing atop a pile of rubble, so we should try our best to avoid that kind of situation. Upon hearing what Demiurge had to say, Albedo nodded her head. Ainz had two questions in mind in response. First, has he ever said something like that before? If you surveyed 100 of Nazaryk's denizens on the question, who is correct, Ainz or Demiurge, perhaps a majority, no, 99 of them would be certain that it was Ainz. Only a single person would be against that notion, and that person is Ainz Ooal Gown. But how credible could he be as a person who couldn't even remember what had happened a week ago? Which was why, although Ainz had no recollections of this, since Demiurge had said so, he must have said something along those lines in the past. If that was the case, then there was only one correct way to approach this. As expected of you to have remembered what I had said. Demiurge, you've made me very happy. I remember too. I do too, Ainz Ooal. Shaltir, Aura. I'm thankful for you two too. He couldn't figure out if they had actually remembered or had not, but were simply concurring with Demiurge, just like what he was doing. Speaking of which, how have they still not figured out the truth that he's incompetent? Was he really that good at acting? Much time had passed since he came to this world as the Overlord of Nazarick. He had been operating as their Overlord this entire time. They should have seen through his Overlord disguise already. They should have seen through the useless nature of Satoru by now. The conversation continued on as he agonized over this. So, in keeping with Ainz-sama's wishes, we will not be punishing the whole of the kingdom. However, we can't just let them get away with a light punishment. We will also have to put the plan on pause or abandon it entirely for now. At the very least, it will require major deviations. Ainz couldn't help but feel a great sense of guilt at the fact that his words held such prominence in their minds. So that was why. But, Demiurge, did the plans really fail this time? Demiurge, Albedo, and their assistant in the kingdom possessed an incomprehensible level of genius in Ainz's perspective. Would the plan that was the culmination of their minds truly fail? If that was the case, he must keep in mind what he says to them from this point onward. It would probably be best if he kept his mouth shut from now on. So, just in case, he asked again, are we really abandoning our plans? The candy and whip plan? Demiurge looked towards Ainz with a bewildered expression. He had seen this expression on numerous occasions. It was the expression he had made when he was trying to figure out the true meaning behind his words, as if they were all euphemisms said by a being on a completely different level of brilliance. Wrong. Demiurge. I'm just trying to reaffirm what you've said. There are no hidden layers of meanings. You should chill out by taking a bath first. These thoughts disappeared right as Ainz was about to give voice to them. Just as an unpleasant premonition surfaced in his mind, just as Ainz had expected, Demiurge stood aghast as if he had just had a sudden realization. No, wait, could it be? Ainz-sama. Could it be that you have had the same intention back when you immaculately brought the Empire under our dominion? His premonitions were right on the target. What is he saying? Ainz started ranting towards Demiurge in his mind. What kind of a thought process would lead you to that conclusion? No, that's not that case at all, would be the best response, right? But would that response really be appropriate? That's right. After he vacillated for quite a long time, this was his reply. For some unknown reason, Albedo's eyes were opened as wide as Demiurge's. It was it was extremely terrifying. I see, so that was why Ainz-sama had repeatedly instructed us to do so. Please forgive your subordinate for not realizing it immediately. I have disappointed my master. No, Demiurge. How could someone like you, no, how could people like us ever hope to be able to fully comprehend Ainz-sama's ingenious plans? To have forgotten that Ainz-sama's every move was made with a multitude of intents may have been our greatest failure. That's right. It's just as you have said. To have applied the candy and whip policy on a national level. As expected of our Ainz-sama. As expected of the leader of the supreme beings. Ainz laughed at himself. He could no longer understand what these two were talking about. In that moment, a thought flashed across his mind. What if these two had already realized Ainz's incompetence and were just trying to cover for him? They're both geniuses. The truth is, I can't even comprehend how much smarter they are than me. How long would people like them continue to mistake my stupidity for genius? No, that shouldn't have even been possible. Ainz-sama is truly the greatest mind of Nazarick. Exactly, you're completely correct, Kokyudos. To Ainz-sama, someone who's capable of planning on the scale of millennia and myriad years into the future, something on the scale of a few years is nothing, is that true? As expected of Ainz-sama. To be able to plan for millennia ahead, I'm truly in awe. Ainz-sama. What is Demiurge talking about? Who? When did they say that? How would someone be able to plan that far ahead into the future? Don't make stuff up on your own. Ainz suppressed his desire to yell out his thoughts. It would be bad if the two naive children took it as the truth. However, since he had been approving every single one of Demiurge's suggestions, he no longer knew the best way to respond to him now. Plus, if he was to object now, it would most likely create issues for him in the future. So I still have to act as usual? If Ainz was capable of facial expressions, he would probably have a dubious smile right now. After racking his brain, he managed to come up with a response that neither confirmed nor denied Demiurge's statement. No, that's not the case at all. There's no need for our master to be so humble. Oh great Ainz Sama. To be able to think this far out into the future. No, if that was not the case, then he would not have been the leader of the supreme beings. He couldn't handle it any longer, he should just give up the facade. Ainz made his decision. Now then, since we now have Ainz Sama's permission, let's give unto the kingdom the most miserable of punishments. How did the word miserable show up in their conversation up to this point? Ainz was completely baffled. Albedo clasped her hands together and grinned brightly. The adorable Albedo and Demiurge spoke in unison. The Empire, who had surrendered immediately to Ainz Sama, had been given the candy. The kingdom, who had not surrendered, will be given the whip. By doing so, we will be sending a message to everyone else. Candy and whip, the people of this world must choose between them. Woo, things are getting a little more interesting, aren't they, Ainz Sama? Hilma was violently thrown back to where she was taken from. The gate that had transported her back was gone by the time she turned around to look. She surveyed her surroundings as she nursed the arm that had made impact with the ground when she was thrown out. She was in a well-ventilated, spacious, and familiar room. This used to be the head of the gambling division, Noah Sweden's mansion. He had originally purchased this swath of land with the intention to build a casino on top of it, which was illegal. They had successfully built the associated mansion, but due to unforeseen circumstances, the remainder of the plans had to be cancelled. Because of this, the mansion had included enormous rooms meant for gambling, and Hilma was in the largest room of them all. Hilma finally calmed down and sighed deeply. Her body quivered as it was overtaken with joy. Hilma. Her companions rushed over to her. There were 3 others in the room, including Oscar, who rang the handbell on the table. Their eyes were filled with tears. Surely their pale expressions were all out of concern for her well-being. Are you all right? Is anything wrong? How's your stomach? We have some fruit wine. Do you want to wet your beak? The rest of them will come here soon. Noah, Endio, and Oscar, the 3 quieted down upon hearing Hilma's voice. I'm sorry I made you guys worry about me. Never mind that. You must have suffered through a lot. You should take a rest immediately. Noah wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes as he said this. He must have thought that she had experienced that or something equally as horrifying. Hilma had no option but to explain herself. I wasn't put through that, they didn't do anything to me. The atmosphere grew thick as the companions who had been surrounding her had their confused expressions gradually surface, as if to say, was that something that was even possible? I also met with His Majesty, the Sorcerer King. Hilma's moist eyes were like a broken breakwater as a never-ending stream of tears flowed out. His Majesty the Sorcerer King, as his title alone commanded an inconceivable amount of fear, Endio made the sign of a god that he didn't even believe in as he spoke, while the other 2 began to frantically look around the room. Perhaps they were trying to look for any eavesdroppers, even though they had never seen any. It was common knowledge between them that there was always the possibility that someone could be listening in on them. You were granted an audience with him? Glad you were able to return successfully then. Hilma, who was still crying, gave a smile as her reply. Though everybody had been called on by the Sorcerer King, they had bowed the entire time, so no one really caught a good look at his face. However, through the intel they had gathered and second-hand accounts of people who had stolen glances at him, the 8 fingers, including Hilma, arrived at the unmistakable conclusion that the Sorcerer King was the avatar of evil. No, he was simply a magic caster who would use such cruel methods of torture and could ruthlessly crush the soldiers of the kingdom. His Majesty was truly a reasonable master. Not only was he tolerant of my failures, but he was also merciful in his ruling. Suddenly the world around them felt as though time had stopped. Noah was shocked for a moment, but then he shut his eyes as if to offer his pity. In truth, if someone else had said this, the Hilma of a few minutes ago would have probably thought the same as they did. So that was what happened, she's completely broken, or something similar. The two behind her spoke with bloodshot eyes. Hilma, I'm more or less envious of your current situation, if only I was there with you back there, and other laments. No, hold on a second. Perhaps she has some sort of mind control spell cast on her. Hilma, is that true? Noah wouldn't stop asking. Of course, she herself knew that she wasn't under the influence of any spells, but at the same time, she could not prove it definitively to them. Because of that, she just simply ignored his questions and continued to talk. Whether they believe her or not is up to them. I didn't think that I would be returning alive too. The reason why I could return without a scratch was because of our master. His Majesty, the Sorcerer King, truly someone fit to be called a king. If our master wasn't there, perhaps she would have been forced to take responsibility for what had happened. Perhaps, no, this wasn't a hypothetical, she would have definitely been implicated due to that idiot's actions and suffer a hellish punishment for it. The Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom, Albedo, would have definitely done that. If she were in her place, she would have also had someone take the fall for it, even if the punishment was not death, but simply pain and suffering. So from her perspective, the Sorcerer King's decision was infinitely more merciful than the one she would have given. Hilma. Sorry to interrupt your spiel on His Majesty's mercy, but that was out of his candy and whip policy. Is that so? Perhaps that was the reason why. Though she had said so, Hilma did not believe that to be the case. Hilma could tell a person's inner thoughts by the fluctuations in their voice, their expressions, and their partialities. This wasn't some unusual ability, but just something she had picked up over time with experience. It was accurate to a certain degree, and if those feelings were to be trusted, the Sorcerer King and Albedo were not playing the routine of good cop, bad cop. The reason why she wasn't completely certain of her own judgment was because it was incredibly difficult to read the Sorcerer King's thoughts given how he had no facial expressions to speak of. So there was a chance that his assumptions were correct. That's right. After all, I've done so in the past too, so I'm quite familiar with it. But, how sweet is the candy to those who had tasted the pain the whip could inflict. Perhaps we were lied to, perhaps His Majesty the Sorcerer King is a terrifying being that could not empathize with people and his confidants were there to make sure that he doesn't go overboard. Even so, I would still be inclined to believe him. No, or I wanted to believe him. Ladies of the night who were easily swindled by men and were subsequently devastated was something Hilma had seen one too many times. She knew that she was no different than those troubled women she had seen in the past. Even so, she couldn't resist the Sorcerer King's ability to draw people closer to him. Hilma. You've bore witness to countless types of men. You're the best out of us all in terms of understanding people, especially men. Tell the truth, what kind of man is His Majesty the Sorcerer King? As a high-class prostitute, it was true that she had seen all kinds of men, especially those who were high in status or had great authority over people. She had seen that type of man so often that it had become annoying for her. If she were to compare and contrast them, if I were to describe him with a single phrase, it would be a merciful master. He has the clarity of mind to think and judge, but also the flexibility to accommodate his subordinates' constructive suggestions into his own train of thought. He does not seek schadenfreude as a hobby, which would have been par for the course. How should I put this? Right, he just didn't give off that kind of an aura, you know? Of course, he would still give out punishments callously if he felt they were necessary. That is high praise, coming from you. The slightest suggestion of a smile broke out on Hilma's tear-stained face as she laughed. That's right. Though our master is of the undead, he embodies justice and mercy. Even when he's being callous, he isn't being cruel. After all, the consequence of failure is punishment. He could have killed me to send a message to you all, but His Majesty did not do so. She didn't know who had just swallowed audibly, but the sound was reverberating through the spacious room. I hope His Majesty, the Sorcerer King, will remain with us forever. If it was our master, he would have. A depressing silence weighed heavily on their hearts. Someone breathed out the way a missionary would if they had borne witness to a miracle. They did not know when that hellish fate would befall them, but as people who had lived in constant fear, this was salvation. I see, so you're saying that we must be even more loyal than we already are, right? Yes, Noah. We should do so, now that we know. But the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom, Albedo, is still a terrifying master. I can't imagine her saying the same words His Majesty, the Sorcerer King, had said to me, though she had mumbled that last sentence to herself. Her companions who had heard her all had looks of surprise on their faces. It was difficult to read the thoughts of the demon known as Albedo, but her intuition had told her that something was wrong in that moment. Perhaps it was because her brain was in overdrive under those extreme conditions. Her intuition told her, even though the Sorcerer King could be considered a compassionate figure, Albedo was someone who saw people as mere toys. Something like that. Hilma really wanted to try her best to make it so that she and her companions could become direct subordinates under the Sorcerer King. He would be the type of master to reward someone based on their performance and would not treat his subordinates unreasonably. Everyone. Let's work even harder for His Majesty, the Sorcerer King. Hilma said to the three in front of her and shared her thoughts. Afterwards, she began seeking assistance from various sources for the task she had been given by the Sorcerer King. End of the first chapter. If you like my content, join me on Patreon, where you can find more and exclusive novels. Also, you can leave a donation by clicking the Super Thanks button. Thank you very much for your support.